We both shaved. We both shaved. Nice.
Wonderful.
Damn, we didn't even plan that shit.
We didn't.
wow.
Yeah.
Holy shit, Connor, I almost didn't recognize you.
Yeah. I don't worry, the beard's coming back, but that's a nice ass on your mannequin, man.
Bonus topic, or slash topic, or whatever. It has been argued many times in the West that corporations are simply money-making organizations, and they shouldn't be expected to be concerned with ethics. So, when Western companies source materials from Xinjiang, China, they shouldn't be held responsible for possible unethical labor practices. But is there even a limit to this principle? Can we honestly never expect that corporations should give up profits for greater good? And how should consumers respond, or should they not even bother? Okay. So let's go to Joe for our opening statement and move on from there.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about other people's thoughts on this. I try to buy American whenever possible, especially when it comes to musical instruments. Granted, I guess just some context of where my thoughts are on it. Clarinets are just unethically created, and it's kind of just been known within the industry. And one of the things that kind of got pushed was making sure that the big companies internationally were doing ethical practices with things like reed cane and specifically like cocobolo and ebony, to name a few. So what ended up happening when it comes to reed cane and cocobolo and grenadilla is that they use those extracts, combining it with carbon fiber to make instruments that could be created from the shards of the debris. And that just came from pressure from like the environmental side of like the musician community. So I'm very curious to see like what possible proposals people might have in terms of keeping keeping corporations and businesses stateside accountable. Because I think that's something we should definitely explore.
Okay. Thanks so much. Next, Pogan.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the topic, it is absolutely unreasonable to just expect corporations to act ethically without some sort of external pressure acted upon them. They're obviously going to pursue profit as their primary motive, and anything that gets in the way of that, they'll constantly try to get rid of or oppress or sort of like hand wave away. The way in respect to international commodity markets and international trading, the way you do this is not through like, bemoaning the corporation on Twitter or complaining or trying to vote with your wallet, because usually those groups are just vocal minorities that don't really substantially impact the overall profits of the corporation. The way to do it is through taxation, through government regulation. That's presumably the point of a mixed economy. The point of a mixed economy is the government steps in economically when it sees fit. And unfortunately, corporate entities have such a high degree of power in the modern United States that they're often able to circumvent unethical practices internationally in the commodities market just by lobbying politicians. So ideally, you would just impose stricter taxes and stricter economic regulations on these entities such that they're disincentivized to engage in unethical international practices. I'm just very, very pessimistic given the current political climate regarding that issue specifically.
Thanks so much. Connor.
Yeah, so one of the most confusing and base politicians in history is Theodore Roosevelt, who was a very big fan of trust busting. I am not a fan of this right-wing worship of the market and capitalism, and you can think that you can think that Tucker Carlson is a piece of shit or a white nationalist, but he said something that was actually incredibly interesting, which is basically he doesn't worship capitalism, he worships God. And I think that's basically it's a misallocation of priority, where effectively what we've done is we've attributed our identities to ideologies rather than like practical policy, human well-being, anything like that. And so what I would like to see on the right is, rather than like this vaunting and worship of the market, is allow the market to do what it does, where it does well, and where there is failure, have the government intervene. And I think that public pressure has a history of changing things. We no longer have slavery. We are currently pressuring people for their extraction of rare earth minerals and diamonds. and we don't have to shoot landlords or ban the bourgeois in order to improve the world. So that's kind of where I'm at, where I think incremental change, I know it's boring, I know it's not sexy, I know we have less himbos in the pragmatic, centrist Chad movement, but maybe eventually I'll do steroids and then I can compete with Hassan Piker for like political himbo status. So
Thanks so much, Rob.
Here's hoping.
Yeah, I sort of agree with counterpoints there. I'm not someone who's a total 100% capitalist, no free market. Clearly, there's a point for regulations. I'm just closer to more of a free market than most people, but I think it's a threshold argument that we understand there's an importance of regulation. Sometimes now, when is that threshold when we regulate? So it'll be interesting to get into that conversation. I would just take it here that I haven't heard anyone mention. The problem, everyone's saying good things. Well, maybe the government should step in and regulate if there's unethical behavior, but there's two problems. One, who determines what's unethical and how unethical does something need to be before the government steps in? I think we could all agree something like slave labor from like Uyghur Muslims, that should be something that our government should step in and ensure that we're not using products based on that. But if it's people paying someone the equivalent of $5 US dollars an hour, is that unethical? Maybe, probably not, in my opinion. So there'll be some discussion there. But I think the greater point is this: in order to get that public pressure, you need to have the public be informed of when these unethical practices are occurring, and they need to be able to trust the agencies or the groups that are informing them. We have so much of the control of information controlled by 5 or 6 corporations. Do we really expect those corporations in an ethical way to talk about how businesses and corporations that they may have business connections to are engaged in unethical practices? And what ends up happening is we see all the time that it's sort of arbitrary. We'll go after one industry because the media doesn't have a vested stake in it, but another industry, that perhaps the media, maybe NBC Universal has connections to someone in China, so some organization in China, so they're not really reporting as fairly about the unethical procedures that are going on there. So I think is with all of this, that the crucial fact is we need more free information, and we need, like, when you hear the media pat themselves on the back and talk about how important they are, ironically, they're right. We just don't have a free press. They're terrible. And then there's a tangential problem, which we could talk about if we have time, which is sort of woke capitalism. And philosopher, postmodernist Zizek talks about this, where companies are building in their wokeism into their products. They're not actually doing anything to make things more ethical, but they're pretending. So you say, I spent an extra $2 to buy this Starbucks coffee, but it went to help Ecuadorian farmers. And then in reality, it's not really doing that. It's still exploiting them. So we have to be careful, I think, and try to be more informed consumers. And I do think as a consumer, you should make choices that align more with what your world vision is.
Thanks so much. Socrates.
Well, Rob spoke a lot, and I agreed with pretty much everything he said. So that's pretty cool. Excited about that. Yeah, when it comes to that information, I would say even more so than being kind of sequestered or hidden. Most of it is just not available. The data just doesn't exist at a broad level for how industries are operating. So there's a list that maybe I'll read out later. This is an opening statement, but there's a lot of European organizations that do pretty in-depth, basically investigating and reporting on the actual labor, environmental, sustainability, all these things, kind of practices within different industries, and have kind of modular standards. I think that's a really good way to go. If that's something that we can make worldwide and widespread, something the US can adopt, something lots of countries can adopt as a standard, something modular, so we can say this company has labor standards that hold up in these like 12 out of 33 ways, and environmental standards out of 7 out of 50 different ways. And that way, anything that they do that improves standards even incrementally could have, maybe we could have a tariff. If it's low, maybe that tariff would decrease the better their standards get. It would make American production more competitive with production overseas. And it's something that customers could actually have transparency over. There's a lot of we talk about, well, it's only a vocal minority of customers who actually want anything. It's understandable for people to be kind of skeptical or pessimistic that really their choices matter, because people don't really have the information to anything to actually make informed choices. Most of that data just doesn't exist.
Agent 10.
Yeah, so companies are going to do whatever is best for profit, whether ethical or not. The quote unquote, like vote with your dollar type of deal. I don't really buy all that stuff. No boycotts have ever worked. I think you just make your own life harder, and you're a bit foolish if you think it does work. But if a commission or a government body or something wants to pop up and regulate or monitor stuff like slave labor and other labor stuff, yeah, I'd be fine with that.
Layman.
Yeah, with this topic in particular, I mean, I'm not in favor of, unethical labor. I'm not in favor of multinationals having too much unilateral control over these sorts of things. Like everybody said, when it comes to making money, it's sort of an amoral practice. It can lead to good outcomes. It can lead to bad outcomes. It depends on what's going on. This particular topic usually comes up today, especially here in Canada, and I think in the United States as well. And recently, when it comes to the China situation and how China exploits their labor there and a lot of unethical things that they do in China, I am sympathetic to that because, I mean, I don't think anybody here is pro-China. I think that we all recognize it's a terrible authoritarian government or whatever. But the issue that I usually have is what these solutions to these problems are. And I'm totally in favor of regulating big businesses. I'm totally in favor of solid, like progressive taxes. I'm a little more left economically that way. But an issue that I have when it comes to the China thing is a lot of us are, I think the way that their economy is growing is kind of scary given how much global influence they have. And I think that a lot of the solutions to that are not necessarily good. A lot of people propose like these sort of like protectionist tariff kind of policies, but I've seen no evidence that those actually do anything to like antagonize China in any way, and we lose a lot of economic benefits from that as a result. Not only the typical like neoliberal talking point of like prices of goods and stuff going up, it also creates a lot of disemployment long term. Tariffs and protectionism are good if you're a developing country, and then once you get into the global market, then you have to open things up. But a developed country, from what I understand, based off of all the economists that I've looked into as a layman, usually they suggest that free trade probably a necessary and good thing. So yeah, I would, the most that I would be in favor in regards to something like that with China's unethical practices that certain nations want to distance themselves from would maybe be to like reform out of trading with China and maybe trade with another nation that would be like an ally of theirs, or just a place with comparatively more ethical labor practices. But yeah, that's how I feel about that right now. We all agree too much corporate power bad. Some level of regulation good. I don't think there's any ANCAPs in here, so we'll see how the conversation goes from there, I guess.
Maddie.
Yeah. So something to remember when we think about existing in a capitalist society and the way companies conduct business is that they are always going to be driven by profit and lowering that bottom line. And the idea that there's any sort of ethical consumption under capitalism is false. And I think there are a few reasons for that and some approaches that we could take and policies that could be implemented to help address some of the ethical issues as well as solving some of America's economic issues. So our corporations used to balance the interests of their stakeholders, which include employees and customers and business partners. And they did that pretty well up until about the 1980s. In the 80s, they decided their only legitimate and legal purpose was maximizing shareholder value. And that's a shift that is causing a lot of America's economic problems. So in the early 1980s, America's biggest companies dedicated less than half of their profits to shareholders. More recently, so in the past 2-3 years, they have sent 93% of their earnings to shareholders. So when you think about that at scale, that's trillions of dollars that would have otherwise gone to workers or made long-term investments that's instead being funneled to shareholders instead. So when you think about the decisions that these companies are making, they're making it simply with their shareholders in mind and not with the livelihoods and well-being of their workers. And of course, the results have been predictable, right? So worker productivity has risen, but wages have stagnated. The share of national income that goes to workers continues to plummet. The pandemic was a perfect example of this. And because 84% of American-held shares are owned by the richest top 10%, while more than 50% of Americans own no stock or have no actual stake in these companies, it's basically making the richest Americans richer and is leading to these decisions where they're going to the cheapest possible producers to maximize those profits. And of course, we're getting no share of it. So I think there has to be some things addressed, not only in how we regulate businesses domestically, but also with our trade policy so that we can provide additional incentives for those companies to work with partners abroad that meet our standards of labor, of ethics, and just ensure that we're keeping everyone held accountable. If we're going to exist in this capitalist society, let's truly make it an even playing field.
Okay, open to the panel.
Yeah, I want to give you guys some more fuel to your fire for criticism, because this is the balance that I'm trying to strike with my perspective, and I can't really do it fully. So basically, if you were looking at the history of like dialectical materialism, or like the commodity exploitation of like the quote unquote global South in the modern context, this is also the history of America. Okay, so basically, like the southern United States was almost exclusively a commodity producing geographic region, and one of the major economic complaints of like the past 200 years was the fact that I'm in Florida. People in Florida would basically create commodity, or they would mine commodity, ship it off to the Northeast. The Northeast would create finished goods, and then they would resell it back down to the South at higher prices. And because of that economic dynamic, that people could barely afford luxury goods, furniture, housing, like cookware, like all that kind of stuff. But what happened as a result is, because of the economic relationship with production, there was a small but real economic benefit to those regions. And since those regions benefited, eventually they are now competing as, like geopolitical statewide peers. Florida just passed New York. It was a 200-year project, but Florida has just passed New York for population. I'm sure our GDP is still lagging behind, but we've still passed them in population. I think we're top 3 for population. I think we're top 4 or 5 for economy. So these relational dynamics do not last forever. And so my thing is, if you're in a country that only has commodities, you export your commodities, you only maintain a fraction of the wealth, you get final goods back, that is still a better relationship than trying to create things from scratch. And the reason why I can't dial that in from a socialist mindset is because I don't know how you industrialize or become modernized without interacting with the global market in this not temporarily exploitive, because I guess it's always exploitive, but you don't interact with this materialist increase in well-being that is a marathon, not a sprint. And I'll leave it there.
Go ahead, Socrates.
Yeah. So I think what you just said is great. And I think that lays out a ton of this, which is a big piece of that is that within the South, that there was an incredible amount of wealth and value that was generated, but it was a very, very small minority of individuals who became vastly wealthy. And you have this like really steep pyramid where you have people who are obviously in chattel slavery, not gaining any wealth. You have people who were however many steps above that who are not enslaved, but were working for the massive plantation owners. And then you have a very, very small number of people at the top who are making a huge amount of that money. And potentially one thing that almost could have aided that process is something that could still be relevant today, which is either from a consumer or tax or tariff level, actually putting a cost on the treatment of humans, or the sustainability today obviously is a huge thing, which people care about to varying degrees during different periods of time. But I think people care a decent amount today. I think there's like a will for that. But that's something that could have, it's like, well, you're not going to acquire so much wealth if you treat people this way. You need to start treating them better to start making any amount of wealth. That's something that could push that dynamic in a somewhat better direction. Pogan had his hand up for a long time on here. Yeah, is to say.
Go ahead, Pogan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for pragmatic considerations economically. I'm all for regulation, things that improve quality of life, prevent exploitative practices. But I mean, the point is ultimately governments and corporations are going to be forever locked in this tug of war where corporations, which are obviously the drivers of economic progress, constantly want to have fewer regulations, fewer limits on what they can do internationally. So they're going to influence geopolitics internationally and politics domestically just to further their primary agenda of extracting profit. I know that's like, socialist talking point 101, but the point is really you can't expect corporations to fall in line and be totally compliant in terms of like ethical standards set by the populace, because they're always going to find some way to circumvent those things and try to extract profit to the greatest degree possible. I also wanted to make a quick comment. Rob specifically said something in his opening statement on this topic that I found interesting. It seemed like what he was alluding to was he's not really sure like by which standards something would be determined to be unethical in regards to a corporate practice. I just take it that if there's a consensus view among a given population as far as what a corporation should do or what an economic position should be, you ought to defer to the majority of the people. We are a democracy, at least on paper, after all. But I was interested, Rob, if you want, can you expand on why you think it's not necessarily, for instance, unethical to derive profit from severely underpaid, arguably exploited workers in the third world or any of those things? Maybe just hash out your position a little bit if you don't mind.
Sure. So on at face value, it could seem like you could look and say, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm an expert on international currency and stuff like that. Sometimes it can be quite tricky to see exactly how much a worker is being paid in a foreign country if you don't know the exchange rate. What does that mean to our standard of living into the West? But I'll say in general, oftentimes it could look really bad, but you have to take certain considerations into effect, such as what is that job or that wage compared to what they would have been getting without that? So we could look at something and say, my God, this looks inhumane. It's terrible. Now, there are certain things that are just clearly like the Uyghur Muslims being interred and things like that. That's clearly beyond the pale. But if we're talking about just low wages, lest we forget that during the Industrial Revolution, if there was a superior society at that time looking at what the United States was doing during the Industrial Revolution, they may have said, oh, no, this is unethical. But that, its counterpoints, I think, was kind of alluding to this, that we had some short-term pain, but that led to not just the United States, but poverty in the world being alleviated, basically off the back of what was happening in the West and things like the Industrial Revolution. So it becomes very difficult. For example, if I live in, say, Pakistan, and I'm surviving off $2 a day, and then Nike puts a factory in, and they're like, hey, we'll pay you $5 a day, that seems ridiculous to us. But if we would shut that down and say, no, our government's going to make sure that we won't get any products that come from there. Well, now the life of that Pakistani gentleman has been diminished again because he loses that job, which was more than a 2 times increase. So I'm just saying it becomes difficult, right? It's easy to fall in the trap of looking at things through Western eyes or looking at things through our privileged lives' eyes and saying, well, this is unacceptable there. Again, I'm not saying things like slave labor, things like the Uyghur Muslims, but I think we have to be careful on what we consider unethical to the point that the government should not allow it.
If I may, just really quick, because I know other people want to jump in here. I think that's fair. It's not controversial to say something. One of, like a major driver of the, say, buildup of China economic and other formerly third world countries has been capitalism, the influence of international mega corporations, the commodities market, etc. But the point is, like, China, I don't think it's controversial to say, is considerably more authoritarian than the United States is, and a large reason they've been able to develop themselves economically to the extent that they have, and a big reason they've experienced such an economic boom isn't just because they got lucky or because they made good business plays. A big reason for that is because they're so exploitative and so oppressive with respect to their labor working class. They deliberately suppress wages for their workers in such a way that it accelerates economic growth. And when international corporations that are based in the United States, for instance, take advantage of that, you can say it's ultimately beneficial for us economically, which I'm sure it is if you look at the data. But the point is, you're basically looking at China, handing them a couple dollar bills and saying, it's okay that you deliberately suppress the wages of your people to accelerate your own economic expansion. Here, we'll engage with you on the international commodities market. We think what you're doing is okay, or we think it's bad, but it's more important for us to have a greater bottom line. And I think that's what people are objecting to. They say that sort of international trade is unethical. That's the chief objection.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, really quickly, like one thing that Pogan brought up that is so true is that part of how China suppressed or like made sure that wages were kept low is they've also artificially devalued their own currency, like systematically over the course of the last 30 years. And that process has kept them competitive, even when, if they let just regular market forces sort of work as intended, their goods would not be as cheap on the global market than they are right now. So a really aggressive approach to currency devaluation is also something that they have done, and like that's something that the United States has even like called them out on and yelled at them about.
Let's go to Agent 10, Connor, Socrates, and then Rob. Okay.
Yeah, since China's been brought up, so what's the solution to this problem? Do we just sanction the hell out of them, or do we just not even engage in trade whatsoever? Because if we do the latter, it's going to be incredibly like catastrophic.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on this. Well, yeah, I'm sure you guys have something to say, but I can piggyback off this point because it's almost my point as well. So oftentimes there's a lot of like moral criticism from lefties about the way we run our institutions in the right wing or in capitalism or in the Western world or our history or something like that. And also I see this criticism as potentially productive. I mean, this is the kind of criticism that resulted in the abolishing of slavery. This is the kind of criticism that resulted in like the labor movements of the early 20th century. It resulted in a whole bunch of positive things that most everyday working Americans benefited from. However, oftentimes what I hear from lefties, especially online, is not like, hey, let's form a union in order to negotiate health care and better wages. What I hear is, let's destroy the fucking system. And when I look at the history of destroying the fucking system, what I see is China. What I see is the Soviet Union. And what I see is as unethical or even more unethical attempts to industrialize. I see people who are basically made worse slaves than arguably a lot of things that happened under capitalism or colonialism. I see mass political purges, executions. And then on top of that, I see the modern hybridization under the CCP where they're like, hey, we're still going to be under a monoparty and you basically can't do anything without us potentially killing you. But at the same time, we're going to open up the market so weakening our power, industrialize, and become competitive on the global stage as a world hegemon. So just to summarize what that question is, what's the alternative to gradual reform and unionization?
I'm the most socialist-y person on here, as far as I'm aware. Maybe somebody can correct me. I'm not saying something like, I like to describe myself as a pragmatic socialist. I'm not saying, grab your AKs, it's time for the insurrection now, we're overthrowing capitalism. Clearly that's ridiculous, right? That's absurd. I advocate for like pragmatic policy consideration and reforms.
I don't know. I'm on twitter.com
right.
a lot.
I wore my Adidas today. Let me strap my AK. Come on.
But the point is, like, even though, like, ostensibly my goal in the very, 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 very long term would be the abolishment of capital, the establishment of socialism as the global hegemonic economic system. Right now, in the interim, in the short term, we can advocate for things like you're talking about. We can advocate for stronger restrictions on international capitalistic exploitation, stronger restrictions on corporations internationally. And the pushback on those proposed regulations, that proposed legislation, seems to always be, well, what if it cuts into our bottom line economically or threatens the economic expansion of the United States or the economic role of the US or its role as a superpower? And the answer is pretty simple. I'll just bite the bullet. If the question is losing a bit of economic dominance in favor of ensuring that people's quality of life internationally improves substantially, or at least improves moderately, I'll take the bullet. I don't think the United States has to be the shining city on the hill anymore. It doesn't have to be the most dominant economic player at all times. It's just not necessary.
So,
Hey, Connor,
I'll
can I ask you something as like part of your response for later?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Because we had this conversation about maybe was it you and I about reform and stuff like that, and like versus like reform versus abolishment versus defunding. Like, is your problem the language that individuals like Pogan would propose, or is it the practice of the policies or prescriptions?
It's oftentimes the practice, and I'll try to make this analogous. It's often the practice of the prescriptions that bugs the shit out of me. So, for instance, and I'll try to be brief, Prime. I know there's people waiting, but basically, like, so for instance, if somebody said like unionization, basically all I see that is collective bargaining for benefits and money, and on top of that, most union employees want to keep their jobs, right? So their job is not to like bankrupt or run a company into the red, because if they run a company into that red, that institution disappears. They're no longer employed. So that can be a negotiation between capital and the workers in order to improve worker conditions. The problem with the laissez-faire economy as it exists now is basically in 1980s, Reagan did like a whole line of fucking cocaine and said, fuck communism, I'm going to build space lasers. And been kind of riding that high for the past like 30 or 40 years. I think it was really easy for my boomer parents to ride that high for the past 20 or 40 years, but they're looking at my economic prospects, the economic prospects of my brothers, the economic prospects of our peers. They're seeing millennials living with their parents, even if they're working full time. They're seeing a whole bunch of economic problems that they were able to ignore 20 or 30 years ago. And even my boomer Republican parents are saying, oh, maybe you do need health care and a living wage. Weird.
Let's go to Socrates, Rob, Maddie, then Pogan. And then
so I call myself a communist, maybe a socialist. Who knows? It seems like everyone's got their own definition of how that works. But just to go back to I think as Rob laid out, this kind of evolution of capitalism. I spent months reading Das Kapital, so now you have to learn a little bit of the history of capitalism, which is that a huge amount of wealth is generated through exploitation. That's not a morally loaded like statement. That's just like a factual statement of how wealth was generated. A huge amount of wealth, and part of that was a huge generation of raw materials, huge generation of labor. Through that, a huge amount of innovation was created. So a huge amount of technological process was done in a short amount of time. And some of that could be applied back to the population. I believe, I don't know specifically for the Nordic countries, if this is how they achieved what their kind of socialist seeming whatever thing now is, they took a lot of that wealth and they brought it back to social programs, education, safety nets, all of that, made the population really healthy. But in the 19th century, in the UK, where there's this huge expansion of capitalism, as capitalism grew and as it spread up to the north and Ireland, things started sucking more and more for the people. As it spread from the UK into India, things sucked more and more for the people working there, and the wealth was extracted into the UK. So you have the generation of wealth, and then you have where the wealth goes. What I don't like about kind of like a soft socialism that's like, oh, maybe we don't have to be as productive. We can kind of be nicer about it, spread it around. I don't think that socialism can kind of take over that way. As Marx foretold, we'll see if it turns out to be true. He said that socialism will overtake capitalism when it becomes the more productive system that just necessarily overtakes capitalism, the way capitalism overtook feudalism and other systems, right? So it has to be productive somehow. It has to be really, really productive. But we have to keep in mind that there's the production of wealth or exploitation, and then where that wealth goes. I really want to see what Counterpoints has to say.
So we'll go to Rob, Maddie, Pogan, Agent Layman, and then Connor. But you see, Pogan, you're not the only socialist on this panel. Socrates.
Thank God, dude.
Solidarity forever. God.
Socrates also hates America. Isn't that right, Rob?
Hell yes.
I don't hate America.
How much do you hate Canada?
It's the world. He's advocating for communism.
Canada's our fun little.
I hate it almost as much as all the other countries. But
I love America so much I want to change it.
Two kind of areas that I want to talk about, because there was a lot that it said. So the first, just real quick, is endorsing full-fledged socialism or communism is a disaster, as it's always been. It will always be bloody. It will always lead to starvation. declines to take into effect the idea of what makes humans what they are and what it means to be human. And we need some sort of profit motivation. It's just inherent in who we are. Every time we've seen socialism or communism attempted, it results in a disaster. Now, real quick, we could see with capitalism, thanks to capitalism from 1970 to 2016, the worldwide poverty rate declined by 80%. That means that there are 80% less people living on less than $2 a day. That's primarily because of capitalism, free markets, and things like that. Now, there is kind of some middle ground here, though, because pure on federal capitalism, I think that what we're seeing is, and this is why I think it's ironic what Pogan said, capitalism's no doubt, primarily in the West, has no doubt been an incredible engine for the growth of the world. The problem is we've been so interested in free trade and things like that, that the world got wealthier at the back of the American worker. So American workers' wages have been stagnant for about 50 years, but it's because all of these corporations have been outsourcing the labor, keeping that labor that stagnant in the United States, and then outsourcing it to the rest of these countries. So there is some room for how do we, like, I agree with the fundamental question. China is not just are they unethical, but they're our biggest geopolitical rival. And if they become world superpower, if they become the unipower, I shudder to think the human rights abuses and the exploitation that they're engaged in their country, how it'll be exploited all around the world. So that's the first thing. And that's why it's important to remain the shining city on the hill. The second thing is this, like the irony I see in all of this, there's some agreement here, which is good. But the irony I see coming from the left is the topic was kind of like part of it, I think, was what should we as consumers do? Well, the irony is all of these corporations are endorsing left-wing causes and then also endorsing China. For example, the entertainment industry, huge relationships with China. They do all sorts of shady things, like something that people on this panel might be interested. Go look at the poster for the Black Panther in China. They cover Chadwick Boseman's face because they don't really care for Black people in China. And Hollywood capitulates to them over and over and over again. It's really disgusting. And yet the whitest people in our country, those in the entertainment industry that want to talk about left-wing causes and how terrible our country is, they're cozied up to China and the abuses, and they don't want to talk ill of the abuses we see in China. So there's a fundamental problem that we have, that those of us on the right are looking at these corporations like the tech companies, the entertainment industry, sporting events, clothing stores like Nike and stuff, and we're saying, yeah, what's up with them being buddy-buddy with China? People are so quick to jump on, oh, the United States is terrible, it's this, it's that. Yet the same people doing that are making huge amounts of money from China. When will the left stand up and say, these corporations that we've given all of this power to control how our countries ran, the flow of information in our country, they're also buddying up with the government of China. So what are you going to do if you're on the left? Are you willing to stand up to the NBA? Are you willing to stand up to the entertainment industry? Are you going to stand up to Twitter? Are you going to stand up to Facebook, stand up to Google that have engaged in all these practices? We'll see.
Yeah, fuck the corporations. I'm with you, Rob Nora. Let's tear them all down. Antitrust, destroy them all.
Clarifying question, if that's okay.
Maddie, do you mind if Joe makes a clarifying question? Because you're next. Mind?
I mind. No, that's fine.
Okay, go ahead, Joe.
That's fine.
Yeah, so how do you approach an argument that I'm sure Pogan has somewhere swimming in his head that capitalism is a violent practice and has a history of violence?
It's not violent. It's not that capitalism is inherently violent. It's that every movement, when it comes to power, has some form of violence.
Sure, right? I never said it was inherently violent. I just
right. So, I mean, you could say the difference is this. We could see when we look at the countries that were communist and we look at the countries that are capitalist, we had this experiment with the Soviet Union. We had this experiment with Red China. We could see this in Cambodia. We know what happens. There isn't even a comparison. That doesn't mean that there's not always room for improvement. I'm willing to have a discussion with those. I don't think we have a pure capitalist system. We have socialist policies. Even the Scandinavian countries that people talk about, they're not pure socialism, right? But if we're talking, and it seemed to be that we have at least two members here that are talking about embracing a system of pure socialism, the tyranny that would exhibit, taking away total private property from people, is not going to end well. It's a violation of rights at an unprecedented level. And we can see every time it's been attempted, the horrors that it's inflicted.
So your argument, just so I'm understanding, is that if you compare socialism and capitalism 1-to-1, capitalism would lead to better outcomes. Is that a fair way of representing that?
Let me just, it's 10 seconds to clear it up. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have any socialist policies. Like, I might want less than counterpoints, but counterpoints makes a great argument. Capitalism can't solve everything. Sometimes for example, our right to defense. right? We don't want to leave it up to people marauding around with guns. We have a police force. We have a military infrastructure, right? There are certain things that we have socialist policies, right? And I'm okay with that. I'm just saying that if capitalism's better than socialism if you had to pick one or the other, but we probably need some sort of mix. My mix leans more towards capitalism and socialism, but it's an unmitigated disaster to want total socialism or communism.
And the final thing, and then I'm good for now. Do you think America should pitch media to other countries as it would exist in America?
No. Like, I think the media in the United States is horrific. It's one of the...
So, because you mentioned the Black Panther poster, I think a better example would be most recently, what's it called? WandaVision, where a lot of the sort of wording around that is based on witchcraft, and it's deeply censored in certain countries. So I think there is a level, and it seems like you agree that there is a level of sensitivity that you have to have when you're trying to pitch your media to other audiences. But I guess your argument is that maybe there's like something that's a little bit too far, right?
Right. That's exactly. If it's rooted in, well, they don't prefer black people, I'm not going to listen to Hollywood be woke to me while they're capitulating because they know that their cash cow's China. And so they're willing to engage in basically soft racism blatantly, while back home here, they're saying, we need more black representation at the Oscars. It's shallow. And black entertainers need to start speaking up about this, because as we go forward and China becomes more and more of a market share in the entertainment industry, I think that a lot of minority actors and writers and things like that are going to pay the price, because it turns out China is more authoritarian and less racially diverse than the United States, and it'll start to show.
Let's go to Maddie, Pogan, Agent Lehman, Connor, Socrates.
Yeah, so I think the question that's come up from a number of people here is asking, well, what do we do about this? What are our prescriptions? What are some ways that we can actually incentivize companies to either work somewhere else other than China, or that we're ensuring that whoever those companies are partnering with within China are adhering to what we consider ethical practices, whatever. I think one thing that we can do is establish a set of standards that countries must meet as a precondition for any trade agreement with America. And I also think, and this is something that the president has the power to do, is they should renegotiate any agreements that we currently have to ensure that our existing trade partners meet those standards. So those are standards. And I know we were saying, well, how can you define what it is to be ethical? How do you define, because it varies from country to country. The thing is, there are a number of set established codes and things that are developed by international groups that say just this. So one thing that those standards could do would be to recognize and enforce the core labor rights of the International Labor Organization, like collective bargaining and the elimination of child labor. So that's one sort of parameter that we can incorporate into that set of standards. Another thing would be recognizing and enforcing religious freedom, as reported in the State Department's country reports. So this is something that, again, our own State Department already has developed. Why not extend it to our trade agreements? And then, of course, I think climate change, of course, is a really big question, especially when it comes to doing business with China. So being party to the Paris Climate Agreement is going to be a big deal, and ensuring that the companies or the countries that we're doing business with are also in accordance with the Paris Climate Agreement. One other thing that I think is an actionable measure that could be taken is, I think sometimes there's a lot of right now ambiguity on how trade agreements are developed. They're kept confidential, they're fast-tracked in Congress, and not necessarily open to the public for scrutiny. So I think overhauling the way that our country enters into trade agreements is another good start, because that forces transparency and opens those trade agreements up to scrutiny from the public to ensure that workers' voices are being heard and that Congress can't just fast track something that is going to throw our workers under the bus.
Let's go to Pogan, Agent, Layman, Connor, Socrates.
Yeah, so I'll try to be as respectful as possible, Rob, in responding to what you said. But frankly, much of what you said is a very comprehensive misrepresentation of socialism. The first thing you said is that socialism has always failed. There's some aspect of human nature that makes it impossible, if not incredibly difficult, to implement socialism. I guess it depends on what you take socialism to be. And since the term is thrown around so much, it's important to understand what it is. So if you're a Marxist, which Socrates is going to perk his ears up hopefully here, it's worker ownership of the means of production, the abolishment of capitalism, and the abolishment of economic class, right? So those three conditions, if you want to call a system socialist in the Marxist sense, in the sense that I and presumably Socrates would be advocating, those conditions have to be met, and they were not met in the USSR, China, Cambodia, Vietnam, Cuba, etc. Maybe one or two of the conditions were met, but certainly not all three of them. And that's not a no true Scotsman fallacy, because we're not altering conditions after the fact. We're saying, per the guy that created the political theory, those are the conditions that must be met in order to call the system socialist.
Didn't create the political theory.
Wages are stagnant because of outsourcing is another thing that was said. Right.
Can you
Wages
read
are stagnant.
say
Come
those
on, I'm
three
listening,
things?
guys.
Absolutely.
I'm listening.
Wages are stagnant because of outsourcing was another claim. I'm sure outsourcing does play a role in wages being stagnated. I'm not going to contest that. I'm not going to completely disagree. But the point is, it's in the interest of a profit-seeking enterprise, that being a corporation, to always act in such a capacity that profit is maximized. Hypothetically, if it were impossible to outsource jobs, the people that would suffer from lower wages are workers in the United States. Capitalists would take measures to ensure that wages were suppressed to maximize profits. This is in their nature as corporate institutions. You said corporations are endorsing left-wing causes. Corporations are endorsing socially progressive causes because it's advantageous for their optics. It's advantageous for PR. They certainly are not endorsing anything even remotely related to Marxism or socialism. And no, just because Patrice Cullors, the co-founder of BLM, calls herself a Marxist does not mean a movement like BLM, which has corporate supports, is a Marxist movement. You said socialism has been an unmitigated disaster, citing the USSR and China specifically. I'm not a tanky. Those were authoritarian regimes. They were extremely bad. They caused a lot of human rights violations. But just to point out, a lot of what led to China's success in the market economy, success as a capitalist state, was the central planning that they implemented early on that very rapidly industrialized the country. Obviously, it's bad that people starve to death. Nobody's contesting this, but it laid the groundwork for a market economy in that country later. The USSR, despite being in an advantageous position and suffering from 2 world wars as well as internal political strife, was able to become the world's second most powerful country for about 50 years. So think of that what you will. You and I can agree that they were awful ethically without saying that they were total unmitigated disasters. And of course, they weren't Marxist socialist. You said you were unclear on what socialism is because there are countries like the Nordic countries that have socialist elements. This is true. Most neoliberal countries are mixed economies that incorporate some socialist policies. There has never been, however, a Marxist socialist state in the history of the 20th or 21st century, ever since the Industrial Revolution. I'm almost done, Prime. I know. I'm trying to hurry. Historical materialism is a key point here. Socrates, hopefully, is going to back me up on this one. The human nature thing is odd. The whole point of what we're saying is that we believe people behave in a capacity that's consistent with the material conditions they exist in, rather than comporting to some intrinsic behavior like, say, greed, that makes a system like socialism impossible. And finally, socialists are not advocating for socialism in one country. This is why we're taking pragmatic policy considerations, why we're trying to change the system rather than just blow it up or revolt now. We just think in order for socialism to be successful, it would have to replace global capitalist hegemony. A big reason the USSR and China failed as quote-unquote pseudo-socialist experiments, whatever you want to call them, is because they had to compete with global capitalist hegemony. So that's my PhD dissertation thesis. I'd like the panel to
Dr.
respond.
Hogan, can I ask a clarifying
brilliant.
question? I'm so
Actually,
sorry.
I mean, as we've seen from Richard Wolff, apparently brevity is not a quality of socialists.
No, what was the
Okay.
brevity is the
Can I please
I-
ask a clarifying question that might be
It's
able to
brevity's
help
the soul
Rob's
of
response?
Okay, cool.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
also want Rob to be able to respond to that because Rob has referenced a lot there.
Wait,
Yes.
counterpoints go first. He's been waiting.
Okay, all right, okay.
All right.
Oh, well, no, I actually wanted to bring up an aligned point, which is basically, the Richard Wolff quote of like, socialism is when the government does stuff. And when the government does a lot of stuff, that is communism. And like,
more stuff.
and that's, but this is where
Most
I
stuff.
think that,
That's right.
so for instance, so the reason why I identify as center right and why I think capitalists need to be okay and conservatives need to be okay with the government doing stuff is because the government doing stuff that's not socialism. It's mixed economy capitalism. It is something that I'm comfortable with. And the reason why I'm comfortable with it is because I think there are certain public institutions that are necessary in order to create a happy and healthy and thriving mixed economy capitalist society. Those institutions are the ones that we talked about, that even Rob mentioned. The military is one. He might not agree on education, but I think education is another. Healthcare is one that I know is edgy in the United States to advocate for, but I would advocate for that one. Another one is R&D. I would also like public funding for R&D because I think the private sector misses some opportunities for research. I know this is just supposed to be a rebuttal, so I'll leave the rest of it. But that was one of the things that I wanted to say is I would like right-wingers to be comfortable fighting leftists different than they fight liberal progressives, because those two factions don't always align. Sometimes they're aligned, sometimes they're not. And I would like right-wingers to update their understanding of socialism to a leftist lens, because then I think it's easier to defend mixed economy capitalism and the future of Western society if you just concede the definition and then start fighting them with their definition.
Let's go to Agent, Layman, Socrates, and Rob.
Yeah, so earlier, Pokin, you brought up you would be totally fine with taking the bullet of not trading with China because of these egregious violations, and I'm pretty sure, Socrates, you agreed, and Maddie, I think you fall in line with that too, from what you said so far. So I mean, that's fine and dandy that you guys are so moral and you're high up and everything.
Thank you so much.
But if you think majority of Americans are gonna sit by and have like simple products like Joe's beautiful Adidas sweatshirt costs double or triple the amount of money because we're not trading with China or other countries, and you're very wrong, and that's never gonna happen.
I think
Listen,
Americans.
I got mine when the wall dropped.
Jobs.
Okay.
To be like that.
And when I grab my stripes, I grab the AKs that they don't use anymore. Okay.
Right. I don't think
American made AKs.
Like the lefties in here, myself included, are obviously under no delusions that the majority of Americans are going to vote, act politically in whatever way that is most economically expedient for them. We're just saying something like, even then, you can impose good regulations on China and international trade with countries like China such that you minimize the ethical impact as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's great, but I believe you said you take the bullet and not trade.
I personally, if I was like in charge hypothetically, I would. But I also understand pragmatically the best we can do given the current political climate.
You don't think that's a little bit delusional to keep the country happy or not? You don't think that's a bit out there?
Do you think
what, keeping the country happy through like decent regulations that can, I guess, reach some sort of like.
What are the regulations?
Talking about decent regulations when
people
said,
love it.
Hold on. What are the regulations?
American people aren't being exploited, and you didn't talk about regulations. You talked about not trading with China and taking the bullets.
If there's a distinction between what I would want in an ideal world and what I want given pragmatic considerations, absolutely, right? What I want in an ideal world is for people to not be economically exploited by mega corporations. But unfortunately, I live in a hell world. So given that I live in a hell world, I have to make pragmatic considerations like, well, how do we minimize the ethical impact as much as possible, not how do we eradicate it? I'm under no delusion that it's going to be eradicated.
Let's go to
Pogan.
Layman. Well, you can raise your hand too.
God
Joe.
damn it.
Like that's the thing you can do.
It's such a short, clarified question.
You could just after Layman.
Put me in the queue.
Okay, all right, I will. Layman, Socrates, Rob, Connor, and then Joe.
Yeah, a huge issue that I'm having with the way that this conversation has gone is what side am I? Okay, Agent 10, okay? He's right here, okay? And then Connor, way up here. I think I'm pointing at Rob, but just imagine I'm pointing at Connor. So these two gentlemen asked, when it comes to international trade and exploitative labor in places like China, what is a good solution to that problem? Now, I have vaguely heard this individual mention something, right? But this individual, not Prime, but the gentleman above Prime, this individual, and this individual
you don't have
right
to
here.
actually point at people. You can make
Oh my god,
It's
it's
fun.
I love this. Please.
God damn it.
This isn't the Brady Bunch. Like, come on. Yeah.
It could be.
So these individuals, right? Not Prime, but you get the idea. It seemed like we didn't really talk about any real solutions. We just went into how awful, except you, Maddie. I heard something from you. Okay. That's why I pointed to you earlier. Because I liked that you were actually kind of heading into that direction a little bit. But I vaguely heard something about tariffs from Socrates.
True.
And then, which I don't agree with, so we can talk about that. But most of what I heard was capitalism bad, exploitative labor is bad. We all agree with that already. But these gentlemen were talking about what are the solutions to the problems. And I want the conversation to go that way. Now, if you guys don't, that's fine. But I think that's the best way for the conversation to go. So so we know, the Marxist socialists, what are like some specific policies and some specific regulations that you guys would advocate for? Because I haven't seen any evidence that tariffing places like China and stuff actually mitigates their economic situation to the point where like they would and like reasonably pressures them into actually improving their labor conditions and stuff like that. I haven't seen any evidence of that. And the economic hit that we take back at home, my concern is whether or not that's worth it. So that's what I want to know. Like, what's the alternative?
Can I respond to that directly?
Let's. Well, Socrates is online, and I'm sure he can.
Sure.
And when I say alternative, I mean a policy, not like let's have socialism. And I know that's what you guys agree with, but yeah,
Socrates.
I'll get back to you.
Staying neutral like a true Canadian.
So I'll give you what you wanted,
Take the
but only after a lengthy, unrelated explanation. So because I don't think Rob Noor has had enough very long lefty memes talking out of about what socialism is, and quickly give my thoughts. Socialism is a production model, like capitalism is the way the goods are produced. So here's what it's not. It's not being racist. It's not being homophobic. It's not being transphobic. That's just descriptions of not being a piece of shit. And corporations that pretend to not be a piece of shit for clout, while being pieces of shit and supporting pieces of shit, are double pieces of shit. But that has nothing to do with like capitalism or socialism, right? Those are like social things and trying to not be a piece of shit or pretending not to be a piece of shit. So in capitalism, corporations that are run by a very small number of people decide, this is fucking Richard Wolff talking points, decide how goods are produced and what goods are produced. In socialism, whenever that happens, or in the small ways that that's occurring already, a larger group of people, hopefully the whole society, is kind of involved in deciding how goods are produced and what goods are produced in what quantity. Right? So that sounds pretty good. An economic era isn't 100% one thing or another thing. We moved into capitalism over time. We call it capitalism because capitalism is the predominant force, but it'll probably never be like 100% socialism. Like that's not really how we usually define these things. And also socialism, if Marx is correct or whatever, it's inevitable, right? So here's a thought experiment. How would you prevent, so like Rob Noor, how would you prevent capitalism from having happened? How would you stop capitalism from having occurred? You're like, I want to stay feudalism. I want to stay mercantilism. I don't want capitalism to happen. How would you stop that from preventing? If you're on a panel, how would you stop capitalism from occurring? Right. So to get back to the topic, to give layman what he desperately wanted, here's some examples of some so what I said as the first most important policy, the first like building block, the foundation, is that we have some kind of transparency, that consumers and governments and even other corporations actually know what the standards are. So there's a huge set of ratings. There's the CDP, you can look this all up, the CDP, EcoVadis, ISS ESG, MSCI, Sustainalytics, and Vonix, just to name a few. There's a number of industries and industry standards that actually go through and investigate different corporations and look at their standards in a variety of number of ways, from workplace protections, safety, labor, sustainability. These are all things that are important. And I didn't say that we should just like bite the bullet and not do anything with China, whatever. I'm saying the first step is we have this transparency. Maybe tariffing or taxing based on if places do this really poorly could be useful. And as they do it better and better incrementally, everything they do incrementally helps their bottom line. That seems like it puts the incentive in the right place.
Let's go to Rob, Connor, Joe, Pogan.
There's a lot of talk of hypothetically biting the bullet. Unfortunately, if the Marxists get their way, we will be biting a bullet, as has historically been shown. So what you see here is it is a no true Scotsman's fallacy, and this is what socialists and Marxists always want to do. They always want to say, no, the historical. They'll pick and choose when they use historical examples. So, for example, you see Pogan. He says, "Oh no, the USSR, Mao's China, that weren't examples." But let me tell you what they did good. Right. So parts of it will accept and parts of it. Anytime I could criticize attempted implementations of Marxism, he'll say, no, that wasn't real Marxism. That wasn't real Marxism. So, for example, he says part of those conditions have met not all of them. Correct me if I'm wrong, Pogan. The third, I was trying to ask this, the third criteria you said for Marxism is, and I'm quoting, the elimination of class. Is that correct?
The elimination of economic class.
Okay. That's literally impossible. And that's what you'll end up seeing. He's literally saying, if we had utopia, then Marxism would work. I agree. If there was a utopia, we could, through fiat, say
it's a little bit of a straw man, Rob.
It's not a straw man.
It's a little bit of a straw man.
Let him respond, please, Rob.
We should vote on a straw man.
Right. So what ends up happening, economic class, for example, that would imply that there are people that are doing better economically than others. And we need to eliminate that so that there weren't people that are doing well enough to be in one economic class above another. That's literally impossible to do. It's not going to happen. And because of that, they could just brush aside. Well, everything Marx said didn't come to pass, so we could brush aside any criticisms of attempts to get to Marxism. We could see when you infringe on people's rights to the point where you say that they don't have any free or any private property, where the government owns all of the means of production, etc. We could see the horrors that alleviates to, such as the Holodomor, people that have starved. I let everyone else talk, right?
Yeah.
Who said that?
Let him finish. Let him finish, please.
And just real quick, they didn't respond. We see that since the 70s, 80% of people in the world have been alleviated of poverty because of capitalism. Right now, this is the best time to be alive in the history of the world. Period. It is. When it comes to quality of life, when it comes to life expectancy, and things like that in general around the world. That doesn't mean that there aren't pockets of people or individuals having a bad time, but in general, that's truth. You have no idea. Hogan says he's in hell. You have no idea what hell is. Neither do I, by the way. But if you're saying that today is hell, you have no frame of reference. And this is the danger of people like this. They'll always burn shit down because they think that it's at rock bottom right now and we're already in hell. Well, there is a hell. Again, go to the Holodomor, go to Red China and see what was going on. That is much closer to hell than what we're seeing. If things are doing better right now, and they've admitted we've never had socialism, and we're in it's the best time to be alive now, why would we throw that out to attempt this system? Furthermore, if we've never actually had socialism, why do you think that is? Could it be that it's not possible to get the utopian things that you're suggesting? And again, some of us are advocating for pragmatic things, saying that we accept that there is a role for government to do some things, but we also accept that private property and capitalism also has a role. To just wholesale throw this out and say, no, you can't use historical examples because that's not the type of socialism I'm embracing is nonsense. The last thing I'll say is this, right? When we're talking about solutions, I'll give you just a quick bit in both of this. We saw, for example, Trump propose tariffs. We saw other conservatives propose tariffs. We've seen liberals, Democrats propose tariffs. Then we saw other people, particularly on the left, say, no, the tariffs are terrible. We're talking about international organizations that could be kind of make decisions on this. I mean, for God's sakes, the UN just added Iran to the Council on Women's Rights. Right? So do we trust that they're going to be a body that we could trust wholesale when it comes to trade and things like that? I don't think so. So yeah, just to clarify, socialism, unmitigated disaster. Don't fall for the claptrap that we're in hell and that there is never been the type of socialism that they're talking about and it would all be great. Oh, and the last thing I did want to say, they admit that this would have to be globalist. That would have to be done internationally around the world at the same time. There is no way to get to this. Socrates says it's inevitable. It's inevitable that people will fight for private property and their rights. So you're going to have violent revolution.
Let's go to Connor, Joe, Hogan, Layman.
Yeah, this actually marries up really interestingly with what Socrates asked me, and it was a really interesting point. I'm happy I didn't forget it. I'm happy I wrote it down. So he said that Marxism or communism or socialism will be inevitable once the productivity of a socialist society exceeds that of a capitalist society. And I actually think that's incredibly interesting because basically there is a way that you could sell socialism, to me anyways, it's probably 500 years from now, but it's still possible. So one of the things that would be necessary is fusion power. We would basically need cheap, unlimited power in order to basically help with the things that human beings currently do. The second thing that we would need is automation. Basically, automation would have to throw out 70% of people to the point that they're not productive anymore. So basically, 70% of the workforce literally has nothing to fucking do because there's enough food being produced, there's enough clothing being produced. You can't even get a job at the Gap folding T-shirts because they have a fucking T-shirt folder. And on top of that, the Gap doesn't even have a store anymore. They're just a brand that sells their product through Amazon. Okay, that's the second fucking point. The third one is basically like space mining. So basically like mining rare earth minerals and metals in space, because we do not have enough rare earth materials. We do not have enough metal on the planet in order to produce the kind of automation that would actually throw 70% of the world's population out onto the street. So at that point, I'm completely down for like gay luxury space communism. If my fucking great grandchildren can sit on their fucking ass, become fucking YouTubers and fucking jerk off all day, and like, literally they could wake up at like 7 a.m., weight lift, eat lunch, YouTube, and then play video games and then go home, then that's fucking awesome. And I'm happy. I'm going to have kids, unlike all you anti-natalist fucks. So my kids will actually live to see the gay future space communism, barring climate catastrophe. So I do have like 7 other points that I want to do, but I think that's the main one. Is I agree with Marx's and Socrates' assessment that socialism will become viable once it proves itself that there's no alternative. And Rob, just definitionally, socialism, Pogan already defined it, but basically it would be it's not the elimination of rich people, it's the elimination of owners. So doctors, lawyers, engineers, techs, like all these people would still exist in a socialist society. There just wouldn't be this different class of business owner. There's a whole bunch of problems with this idea that I object to. But at the same time, that's where I think definitionally in America, we're educated that there's like 5 classes, and it's like poor, working class, middle class, upper middle class, and ultra wealthy. And that is not even the same conceptions as a socialist analysis of society.
Okay.
Yield.
Let's go to Joe, Pogan, and then Layman.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of see if Dr. PhD DMA Pogan can provide something for me. Because you mentioned something about cultural, or not really cultural Marxism, excuse me, just social Marxism, just like the definition of socialism under Marxism. Can you like reiterate those 3 pillars for me?
You're muted. You're muted, Pogan. Finally. My existence is validated.
Okay, so I guess he's working on it. This is where leftist equipment has struck again. If you
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, embrace capitalism, you'll get better equipment.
All right. Right, exactly. It's worker ownership of the means of production, which that's already an important distinction, not government ownership. It's the abolishment of economic classes. Connor alluded to this, but that does not mean the middle class, the upper middle class, just specifically bourgeois and proletariat, owner capitalist class, worker class, right? And then it's the abolishment of the law of value, which is essentially something that necessitates evaluation of commodities in a market based on market price, as opposed to the conception of value that Marx had. So those are the 3 pillars that I specifically cited. And I was careful. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So something that I think, do you eat breakfast sandwiches?
I do.
Sometimes.
Oh no.
Sometimes, right. So so what you're arguing is that these 3 things are the core of this breakfast sandwich, essentially. So you have bacon, egg, and cheese. And now
you can have a gradient. You can have a gradient approaching the breakfast sandwich. There are things that have certain properties of breakfast sandwiches, but just hypothetically, let's say there's 3 necessary properties as opposed to like accidental properties of a breakfast sandwich. Let's say it's
just for the sake of like keeping us a little bit grounded. Let's say it's just like bacon, egg, and cheese, and like that's what we determine as a breakfast sandwich in this hypothetical.
Right. You can have other properties of breakfast sandwiches that if something else has it, it's kind of like a breakfast sandwich or closer to a breakfast sandwich, but it's not a breakfast sandwich until you have bacon, egg, and cheese. For the sake of the analogy.
And then part of your argument was that within different societies historically, they may have achieved like the egg and the cheese part, but then like
Right.
whatever the meat substance might not have led to that. So I guess to pull out to center it a bit, would you argue that historically, because different societies with under this type of socialism, because there wasn't that third aspect, whether that be the elimination of economic class or abolishment of an economic class,
Right.
the worker ownership of means or the abolishment of law of value, that with that whole creates a desire to fill it with
Right.
something else.
So-
And maybe that
so-
fulfillment or filling can lead to poor outcomes.
Right. Socrates, who I'm so glad is here as backup, alluded to this already, but the whole idea of the Marxist analysis is you have an economic system like feudalism. It expands, it dies. You have an economic system like mercantilism. It expands, it dies. And remember, this is gradual. These things aren't just changed overnight. Now we are at capitalism, right? So the whole point is, the inference is that capitalism will expand, it will change, there will be a gradual shift to something else, and then capitalism will die. I'm not saying that there are not aspects of socialism in various civilizations throughout history. There were absolutely aspects of socialism in the USSR, in Maoist China, in Cambodia, Cuba. Go down the list. I'm just saying there's the missing secret sauce that we need to call it socialism in a Marxian sense. And that secret sauce, according to the Marxist analysis, is something that is achieved after capitalism dies, after the hegemonic capitalist control of the global economy withers away and is replaced by socialism. This is the whole idea.
Sure. And then a question, and thank you for the response, by the way. And then a question to Rob, because he brought up the idea that 80% of people were relieved from the world because of capitalism. And now my question to you, Rob, was that from a study or is that a historical analysis? I'm just wondering where you got the number 80% from.
So there's so for example, the first site that I found was who did this? It was
it Height?
The American Enterprise Institute.
Wouldn't have been Height.
Okay.
The following chart. Where's this chart from? The World Bank actually was where they charted. Did a study that showed people that had been living under $2 a day since 1970 through 2006, and that number was from 1996 to 2006. That number was cut in half, but from 70 to 2006, that number was cut by 80%. And much of that was because of what we saw as free market capitalism, which encouraged things such personal property, innovations, things like that, that led to food, led to finances being able to be given even to poorer parts of the world.
Was that the conclusion of the people who did the study, or is that your analysis after reading the study?
And both.
So what was the conclusion that the author did? Like, what was their sort of like determination?
Joe, can I just answer this really quick, because I pretty much know what I'm familiar with the work that Rob is citing. So basically, it's just true that like people have gotten above this like standard of living globally, and on top of that, this is not a time period in which like Marxist or pseudo Marxist like socialist societies were promulgating. These are countries that were basically I know a lot of people have beef with the IMF. But these are basically societies that were given like nationalization and industrialization loans by the IMF. They were subject to some levels of austerity. They were subject to some levels of like international influence into their commodity production. So basically, like that's where I don't give a shit whether or not we're classifying like capitalists as self-serving sociopathic assholes who don't give a fuck about the average person. But the truth is that some level of global capitalism does improve the material conditions of the societies it interacts with. And I know Pogan is fucking about to shit his pants, so I'll just say this finally. One of my final points about this is that if you have a deindustrialized fucking like hyper agricultural society and you try to jump straight to socialism, it doesn't fucking work, because if you try to split split like a material good fucking 100 ways, you know, 100 portions of a piece of shit is still 1/100th of a piece of shit. Okay, you have to have something worth splitting before you can split it. So that's where this whole like material analysis of society is going through different industrial phases. Capitalism, maybe some level of market is necessary to create the material well-being for people to even have concerns about the distribution of material goods. If you don't have material goods to fight over, you don't even fucking have a reason to fight over them. Yield.
Sure. A concern that I have that harkens back to Rob's points in his opening. He mentioned the idea of and maybe I'm mischaracterizing what you said, but you said to be informed if ethical practices are occurring, and then also the need for more free information. My concern with your response is that there might be something that Pogan might contest to, is that were the practices that led to this outcome ethical? And again, like I'm sure he can elaborate a little bit better than I, but that's something that kind of rings in my head from earlier.
Can I just make a quick comment?
I think what Pogan would like to say is that
Pogan, not to put words in your mouth.
Oh, Pogan, you're up next anyway. Go ahead.
The study that these two gentlemen, to copy Layman's joke here, the study that these two individuals are citing is frequently cited as evidence for capitalism lifting people out of poverty. It initially had a $1.25 guidepost as what was considered poverty. So if you made above that, that would be considered above poverty, which was then raised to $1.90 as a millennium goal. But the problem is that various evaluations of this study have concluded that's still wildly insufficient for living conditions, even in third world areas like Africa. They recommend something 2.7 to 3.9 times that existing poverty line to be considered livable, which amounts to something like $5 a day to about $7.40 a day. So that study, which is cited very frequently as evidence for people being lifted out of poverty by the free market, is pretty much bunk on its face. But I wanted to respond to something else, and I know Socrates is really wanting to jump in here. I'm not saying we need to get rid of markets. I'm not interested in like merely talking about theory. I want to talk about pragmatism, the sort that Layman was talking about. I'm not saying get rid of markets. I'm just saying long term, as a theoretical conception, capitalism will die. There needs to be some thought towards a replacement system. In the interim, there are things we can do to alleviate economic exploitation, both domestically and internationally. Maddie talked about establishing more worker cooperatives towards the beginning of this call, and I think that's a great first step for two main reasons. The first is I think workers are obviously going to act in their own interests rationally. It's not in the interests of workers to exploit others because they're aware of what worker exploitation is. They obviously themselves don't want to be exploited as they have in traditional top-down corporate formats. And the second reason is I think workers understand that when there's more participation in the market, when there's more economic democracy, so to speak, it follows that products are going to be of a higher quality, products are going to be able to satisfy consumer needs more effectively. And beyond that, absent that top-down CEO capitalist structure that we're so accustomed to in the global international market, you see things like higher quality of life for workers, workers being able to push up their own wages, the sorts of benefits you want for workers here as well as internationally. So just to briefly recap before I pass the baton here, bad study talking about the free market lifting people out of poverty. The standards are way too low to realistically talk about living conditions. I think I'm absolutely interested in pragmatism. Worker co-ops are a great first start. We can talk about other legislative things we can do with respect to the Chinese trade question in particular. And you can be a socialist while also talking about pragmatic politics within a neoliberal capitalist system.
Yeah, so there's this like weird conception that like socialists or communists hate capitalism, or that Marx hated capitalism, right? So there's that guy who like wears a suit and goes to like McDonald's and Burger King and like reviews all the fast food, like Parts of the Week guy. He doesn't hate fast food. He critiques fast food because he obviously cares about fast food. He wants people to be informed about fast food. Marx wanted people to understand, and he wanted to understand capitalism. When you talk about like a Marxian analysis, it's trying to understand what it is that's going on. Capitalism isn't bad. Capitalism is the current dominant economic system. and it has things that don't work perfectly. A lot of those things in America, for instance, are shored up by socialism. We don't currently, although we're moving in this direction, maybe, toward lots and lots of like private armies, but what we have primarily is we have a public army. We have an army that's run by the government and it's funded by our tax dollars. And maybe some people want lots more Blackwaters all over the place, but like overall, we kind of accept this, right? So I just want to clear up, like, once and for all, I'm sure it'll never come up again, this misconception that Marxists hate capitalism. But until we move to some other economic system primarily, yeah, we should figure out, and I'll end this really, really quickly, what we can do to make things under currently existing capitalism better. We live in the information age. Does anybody disagree that gathering much more information about how production actually occurs and the working conditions and the sustainability of different companies, does anybody disagree that this is a noble goal or a useful goal?
Let's go to Layman Rob and Connor.
Okay, so wonderful. So here's my solution to going back to the original topic of the conversation rather than this capitalism versus socialism thing that we got stuck in. I am going to propose some potential ways forward in regards to improving labor conditions and perhaps being a little less reliant on like a global exploitation or something like that. So I'm just going to list some stuff off. We'll see what people think of the policy prescriptions, and we'll go from there. So one thing that we would like to do, or that I would like to do, is incentivize local production. Now, the problem is when a lot of people talk about local production, shit, my fucking camera is out of focus.
No, you're good.
Whatever.
You're good.
So when it comes to incentivizing local production, something that a lot of people often cite is stuff like what Socrates mentioned earlier with the tariff thing. Problem is, what tariffs often do is they don't actually do that. Usually what they do is they cost consumers a lot more. Tariffs, they might benefit workers in like, some like import competing industries, but in the long term, they actually hurt workers in sectors that rely on imported inputs, and those in exporting industries facing like retaliation from like global trade partners. Tariffs also, like they don't help whatever nation that you're in negotiate better trade agreements or significantly improve things like national security and stuff like that. Like what I think would be a better way is to incentivize local production better. So, and now, okay, so I'm going to do some radical centrism here. So brace yourselves for some cringe, everybody. All right. So here, I know that there's a lefty audience watching, so I'm gonna get the fiscally conservative thing out of the way, and then I'll end it nicely with the lefty thing. So incentivizing local production, something that I think would work. Tax loopholes for local startups, so people are more economically incentivized to start businesses locally and branch out from there. Small businesses and stuff like that, increase tax loopholes for those people. Now the problem is when those become chill. So that's the fiscally conservative part, okay? So I know, whatever. It works. I've seen data to suggest this. Now, the problem is those corporations, when they start to become larger, when they start to become multinationals, when they start to monopolize, this shit, I don't like this shit as well. So this is where I get more lefty, and I say close tax loopholes as those businesses become greater, and then you can funnel that back into more social programs and stuff like that, right? So that would be one solution that I can think of off the top of my head that you would actually be able to reasonably sell to the average grill-pilled individual, such as myself. So that's one thing. Also, I liked, Maddie, when you mentioned the worker co-op thing earlier. I actually like worker co-ops. I like them in a capitalist framework, but I like worker co-ops. Like Adam Smith was a fan of worker co-ops. It's you don't have to be a socialist to like worker co-ops. And I like them in like these more, because all the data I've seen on them suggests that you see the success that you see from them because they start off as traditional sort of firms, and then they branch out after a certain point, after a certain level of growth, where the worker co-op can be sustainable in an industry that's not necessarily capital intensive. There's no real data on worker co-ops that are more capital intensive to suggest that we could actually run like an entire global economy off of something like co-ops that equate to some kind of market socialist thing. But I'm not opposed to like co-ops in principle, like a more localized sort of co-op situation. Little bit of distributism splashed in there or whatever, but yeah. those are just some things that I'm thinking of off the top of my head, solution-wise, as it pertains to improving labor conditions here. So I want to know, or labor conditions as it pertains to like the relationship that nations have to each other globally. So I want to know what people think of those solutions, and then get off of this capitalism versus socialism, the evil USSR, real socialism hasn't been tried yet thing, just so we can have a productive conversation.
Could I just have like a one-word response to that?
Sure.
Or
Yeah.
one sentence. Sorry. So just
Yeah.
so it seems like the issue with like just having lowered taxes for small businesses locally is that if labor costs are like 4 times lower overseas somewhere, it doesn't seem like just some amount of like tax benefit is ever really going to quite overcome that. I like what you're saying. I totally hear you when it comes to kind of regressive taxes or whatever, but I'm not quite sure how that combats that, or how it does enough.
Well, I don't know if it does enough, because we idealize in a perfect utopian world where we don't live in a global economy, because like that's what, like if something like that ever happens, it's way beyond our lifetimes, right? I'm trying to do more policy over passion here. So what I'm suggesting is something that would incentivize local production in the short term, so you don't have to rely on these places as much as you do right now. And that's one way to do it without tariffing, because tariffing often hurts workers at home, and I don't want to hurt workers at home. So that's one solution. But again, I'm just concerned, like the lefties are, about too much power because businesses grow, and businesses grow. Sorry, fuck. My wording is fucked up now. When businesses grow, there is that concern about like too much power, too much corporate power, too much monopolization, yada, 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 right? So that's why. Like, I'm thinking of things that we can do right now. I can't do this thing. Maybe this is just my autism. I actually am autistic. That's not ableist. Where I can't focus on like these wild, abstract, like worlds in the future thing. I have to focus on like right now, right here. What can we do right now? Pragmatism, as Pogan said. So these are just some ideas is all.
So let's go to Rob, Connor, and then Joe, and then we might move on to our next topic.
Okay. So just real quick, Pogan talked about the study. The study shows that regardless of how you want to define poverty, it shows that people have almost doubled. If we're going from $1 a day to $2 a day, I agree that you would like to see people have more than that, but things are going in the right direction. Society is better today by almost every metric than it was 50 years ago, than it was 100 years ago, than it was 200 years ago. Pogan already admits, yeah, we haven't had socialism. So it wasn't socialism that did it. It was capitalism. That's what did it. It was the current system that's alleviated that sort of things. Joe gave this
not informative, though.
Please.
Joe gave this example of a breakfast sandwich, and there's 3 parts to it. The problem I have is every time we try to embrace one of those parts in a serious way, we see that it's ended in an unmitigated disaster. That's the problem. So then saying, oh, no, you can't criticize that because it wasn't all 3 parts at the same time. Well, every time we try to get even one of those parts, it becomes a disaster, and the bodies pile up. How much will be enough before we say, geez, maybe this experiment isn't working? Counterpoints isn't exactly wrong when he talks about maybe 500 years in the future. That could be true. I don't know, but we're so far away from there. It seems like, and I think what he's saying without saying it is it's stupid to even have this conversation about global communism or socialism until we meet these things that basically means human labor's all but worthless. Once we get to that point and there's so much free energy and free stuff to go around that people don't really have to work, then sure. We're nowhere near that. So right now we can see, and trying to embrace a system without those things leads to disaster. Layman, just real quick, talking about like the potential solutions that we see today. There are like this idea of worker co-ops, like these are things like, I'm sorry, and I know that people mean well when they talk about these things, but we can have worker co-ops. Who's stopping them? Right? Like, and I don't understand, like, unless you're suggesting that we do something policy-wise so that the government institutes some sort of policy to make these co-ops, basically you would have to punish their competition or something like that. I just don't get it. I feel like oftentimes we spin our wheels like we're sitting around in a drum circle like, hey, man, if everyone just co-opted and unionized, everything would be groovy, man. It's not that simple. There are serious problems when it comes to China. Don't get me wrong. I don't know what the solution is. I tend to favor more of the tariff approach, more of that we have to punish China. We need to get allies around the world that understand that China is engaging in manipulative practices and they're engaged in unethical behavior. And we need to coalition build to let people understand that we need to use our world's buying power to show China, no, we're not going to accept these things. But unfortunately, in order to even start that process, We would have to be able to look at corporations in the United States with political clout and condemn them. And I'm sorry, I asked leftists what they would do because these corporations right now are all virtue signaling to the left, and they have nothing. I hate to say this, but it's true, and I think anyone that could that wants to be honest will see this is true. Most leftists don't give a shit as long as they were going after the orange man. Just like they didn't care if the FBI was corrupt as long as they're going after the orange man. And so you'll leave Nike, engage in slave labor practices, and one of the big
I burned mine.
The NBA or LeBron James will talk about how terrible this country is, but he'll still take those 20 pieces of silver from China, won't he? And the lefties in this country will applaud him, just like they will Hollywood, just like they will Jack Dorsey, just like they will Mark Zuckerberg. And these are groups that are doing authoritarian things and becoming incredibly wealthy overseas. And then we talk about in this country, like we have leftists talk about maybe we should start with worker co-ops. Cool. You keep saying that because these corporations are going to keep working with China. And as soon as they realize that China is the new world power, they're going to jump ship faster than you can imagine. And then we'll get to see a lot of these, tactics of the communists that we're talking about how great they are. They'll be implemented right here at home. And it won't be good. So until we start, part of having the information and saying we need to be able to have information to know when there's unethical practices, part of it is once we know, we have to be willing to condemn them. You don't condemn them and say, yeah, I'm against what Nike is doing with the Uyghurs, but damn, they're really impressive when they had that Black Lives Matter ad. I'm against LeBron James making bills off of, the slave labor of Uyghur Muslims making those shoes. But damn, man, he really goes after the police and those Trumpsters. Until you call them out and say, and by the way, why do you think that these corporations are all virtue signaling to the left? Because the right's lost the culture war. We lost it, right? So it's going to be up to people on the left. You're the ones who could put pressure on these corporations. You're the ones that could force them to say, yeah, we're not going to deal with China anymore because they're unethical. They ain't going to listen to me. They've already showed. They'll boot me off social media in a heartbeat. They'll move, they'll do whatever. 100 business leaders just came together to talk about how we're going to try to punish states that have, voting laws that we don't like. They don't like conservatives. They don't think that market share is going to help them in the future. So until the left starts calling out these leftist corporations that are engaged in these practices, nothing will change. And I'm afraid that most of the left won't, because most of them, not saying anyone in this panel, are more interested in attacking those evil conservatives than actually calling out this unethical behavior.
Okay, so we'll go to Connor, Joe, and Pug, and we'll end it there because we do have other things to do. And other things you guys can yell at each other about. It'll be fun, don't worry. So, Connor.
Yeah, this will definitely be my closing statement. So I just wanted to bring up the fact that my points, because Pogan gave us a beautiful diatribe. So it is basically what I would invite lefties to do is investigate the concept of fascism, which is political corporatism and flexible authoritarianism. I have a video on it called Know Thy Enemy Fascism. I won't explain all of it now, but basically what I would say is that China, actually definitionally from Giovanni Gentile, the person who created the ideology, he would actually argue that it was fascist. If you talk to dissident right thinkers, basically neo-Nazi thinkers and sympathizers, they actually ask whether or not they should advocate for authoritarian socialism because people default to ethnic tribalism in their political organization. So as long as they can get the authoritarian part down, then they can basically do that. And the reason why I bring any of this up is because I understand the no true Scotsman fallacy doesn't necessarily apply when we talk about the historical applications of socialism, and I also know I'm boring layman right now. But the reason why it feels disingenuous is because basically it's if you talk to Mao Zedong and you're like, you're not a leftist, you're not trying to institute communism right now, you get fucking shot in the head. If you fucking try to do that to Lenin, Stalin, any of these fucking people, you get shot in the fucking head. And they're leftists advocating for lefty ideals. So the reason why, because what am I going to do? Turn around and say true capitalism has never been tried because we don't live in an anarcho-capitalist fucking state, because I can't buy fucking my McNukes and my fucking McChild slaves. We don't actually live in a capitalist society. No.
We don't actually live in a capitalist society because it's not how Adam Smith portrayed it in his theory either, necessarily perfectly, right? So
and that's where it feels disingenuous. Socrates, Socrates, I love you, but you're a bastard. Okay, I said that socialism is not when the government does stuff, and you were like, socialism is when the government does stuff. No, don't backpedal. Stop it. dude, let's adopt definitions that we both fucking understand, because we can't say that the military is socialist, universal healthcare is socialist, and expect conservatives to fucking get on board. Every time you say that shit, that like universal healthcare is fucking socialist, they're gonna be like, fuck you, I don't want to eat my dog, you piece of shit. And that's basically the end of the conversation. I only have two more points. So I do not bring up my sci-fi, luxury, gay, space communism examples just for fun. I think it is fun to think 500 years in the future. And also, a lot of our modern ideas are based on ideas from 500 years ago. So I think it is important to talk about the future and the material conditions we might face and the philosophical considerations we must face. And also, I don't take it on. I also take it on face value that some of these incentives, for instance, what Lehman talked about for the prescriptions, are actually real. So the reason why General Electric and Lockheed Martin pay 7% for their fucking corporate tax rates or whatever is because they do not have an effective tax rate. What they have is a potential tax liability of 0% as long as they basically take out through their taxes like tax write-offs. They can reduce their tax liability. And I think you could create worker cooperatives in the United States, domestic worker cooperatives. If you said domestic worker cooperatives had a 0% tax liability and international corporations over a certain size had a 10 or 20% effective tax rate, because then that would make the domestic worker cooperatives potentially competitive with these international conglomerations. That's my last point. Thank you for listening to my diatribe. I love you. Yield.
Joe, and then Pogan, and we'll move on from there.
Yeah, something that I really liked Rob's passion and his response, but it was so much, so it was just hard to find a point to get to. But I think one that I think is important is there is a response from the practices that are happening in China, whether that be internally through H&M or just through the understanding that Nike acknowledged that these practices exist and they promised to look into it to better practices. I think your concern might be, which again ties back into your opening about the idea of being informed that ethical practices are occurring. It seems like you need more evidence and information to determine if the practices over there are ethical. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, and you're more than happy to elaborate in your closing. But yeah, it's just a thought that I have, because there is a response to the situation that you described, but it just seems like the current response to you is unsatisfactory.
Hogan.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. Rob said some things that are a little bizarre, no offense. The biggest one was he cited again the study that I was pushing back on, and just to point out, like, it is important to understand what poverty is defined as, because, again, the original definition of poverty in the study is not anywhere near enough money to meet basic living expenses. And then, a fun fact, when you raise it to what would be required for basic living expenses, which is that $7 number, $7.50 number, it turns out that under that definition, approximately 1 billion people have been added to the poverty class under capitalism in the last few decades. Just a little bit of a fun fact. He talked for a little bit about how he took issue with corporations basically simping for China and trying to appeal to leftists, and how quote unquote leftists would simp back. I don't think anybody on this panel was saying that they support or they're big fans of like corporations kowtowing to them, or corporations doing what is obviously just social progressivism for optics purposes, right? It's very obvious that they're doing this just to not, as Socrates said, just to not come off as pieces of shit when they really are pieces of shit. They're not supporting socialist or Marxist movements, which is generally what we're talking about when we say leftist, at least in that direction, right? It's very obvious the social progressivism angle is just an optics game for them. Connor said something about fascism being comparable to socialism that I wanted to comment on. Certainly China, the USSR were absolutely horrible, abhorrent authoritarian regimes that engaged in massive human rights violations. But I think it isn't useful to conflate broad authoritarianism with fascism. I think fascism is a very particular concept. I think fascism invokes an understanding of capital, or at least is sympathetic to capitalism in some capacity, which is why when Nazi Germany was rising in Germany, subsequent to the fall of the Weimar Republic, what you saw were German business owners choosing the fascists over the communists and the socialists. They would have rathered fascism be installed in that region than socialism, specifically because they perceived that to be more expedient to their causes than socialism or communism would be. And further, of course, under fascism in Nazi Germany and Italy, even though there were nationalized industries, there was also private enterprise. There was still the existence of a capitalist class. And again, just to reiterate this point, because I do want to talk about pragmatism.
Can I brief interjection?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just I levy that criticism at China, not USSR, very specifically because they are liberalizing the market yield.
Sure, absolutely. I wouldn't push back on that nearly as intensely. But just to bring it back to the pragmatism angle, because that's what I'm interested in. Socialism is a gradient. I think most of us are agreeing, maybe with the possible exception of Rob, that even in ostensibly capitalist or mixed economies, there are elements of socialism, there are elements of planning. It's just a question of how much planning you want, how much free market you want. And we're talking about socialism the way I defined it in, of course, a theoretical future sense, but that doesn't mean we can't advocate for more welfare policies in existing market economies, more quote unquote centralized or socialist policies in otherwise, ostensibly market economies. So absolutely, it's not just a question of talking about theoretical luxury space communism. It is a question of how do we incorporate Marx's ideas and general socialist ideas into a current understanding of the market economy, and how do we change it immediately or in the short term to improve quality of life for the greatest number of people. You don't have to be married to like any so-called communist or socialist regime to just say something like, maybe some of these ideas can benefit people in a meaningful way. Maybe over time we can start to gradually move towards that in the interest of people while still working within a market economic framework.
Okay. And so if anyone wants a closing statement, 1 minute long, 1 minute long, and Joe, Pogan, and Connor already went, but a 1 minute long, then I'll give it to you. Other than that, we'll move on to our next one. You want one, Maddie? Go ahead. And Socrates?
Yeah.
Me too.
So I know we kind of went off the rails a little bit debating the merits of socialism, capitalism. Can't say I didn't see it coming, but I'm so glad that we went there because what a riveting discussion. I do have a bunch of prescriptive proposals that I think would help to alleviate some of the inequalities and issues that are caused right now by our existing trade policy, as well as our ability to hold multinational corporations accountable. One thing that I wanted to bring up that I touched on a little bit in my opening was even aside from the idea of worker co-ops, because I do love that structure. I think that we should adopt a system similar to what is adopted in Germany, where 40% of a company's board of directors have to be elected by the workers of that company themselves, so that ensures that workers have a voice. And yeah, I'm right and prescriptive, and that's it.
Okay, Socrates.
Just let it be.
Yeah. So I definitely apologize to Layman, apologize to the chat. We ended up in a just turf war over the definition of socialism. I'm sure that for the rest of the night, none of the topics are going to end up moving in that category. They're going to be very, very concrete, not high level, nothing to do with socialism or capitalism. I think the basic ideas of having some kind of international, national regulatory bodies that literally just do investigations and rate corporations and production companies and manufacturers and distributors based on a number of quantifiable metrics would be really, really useful data to have as a foundation for even understanding what's going on. That's something that data analysts like me could take a look at. And I think it's probably a good foundation to build off of. Maybe tariffs, maybe taxes. Who knows? Somebody who knows about that, tell me.
Layman, Agent Rob. So Layman first.
I hate capitalism versus socialism debates.
Gotcha.
That's one point. Another point is I'm happy that I got to say some policies at first. I'm glad Maddie said some policies too. Maddie, you're based for that. I prefer those kinds of discussions because I think they actually advance the conversation forward. As for whether or not we have socialistic policies, I'm going to respond to this really quick because it's a talking point I hear a lot where people say that like the welfare state is like a socialist thing or whatever. The first guy to invent the welfare state was a guy named Otto von Bismarck. He was a conservative back in Germany, and he invented the welfare state to help workers because he didn't like the Socialist Party running against him at the time, and he wanted to do something to prevent that from happening. So that's just a personal talking point that kind of pisses me off, but that's okay. I love everybody regardless, especially you, Pogan. And
thank you. That you agree? That sounds like a concession, though.
What do you mean?
No. Like it sounds like he's just making a concession to the socialists rather than like, oh, here's a capitalist
No, it was
policy.
specifically so socialism wouldn't happen, but he still wanted to tend to worker well-being, so he came up with this welfare state thing that eventually expanded out. And a lot of socialists today support it now. This guy was around in like the 19th century, 18th century or some shit. So
okay.
But regardless, that's all I wanted to say, and I'm going to close off just by saying I'm glad a lot of people liked my proposals, and I'm glad Socrates entertained a bit of a back and forth at one point.
Agent 10.
Well, the Germans fucked up once again, didn't they? But
hot take.
Going back, I gave the question. I proposed the question, like, what do we do with countries like China that, do these horrible human right violations? And the only answer I got was, we might bite the bullet and just not trade with them whatsoever, which is totally ridiculous. And, there's no other solutions that anyone on the panel gave. So I don't know, what are we going to do just besides bitch about it and do anything?
I gave local production. What do you mean?
Oh, okay. What does that have anything to do against?
Because it incentivizes
China.
production, so we're less
Thank you.
Anyway, sorry. That's it.
Just real quick, Hogan says, I don't know if Rob agreed. Literally, my opening statement on this subject was clearly we have things that are socialist type policies, like the military infrastructure, things like this. So, the only
I just didn't want to misrepresent you, man.
Okay, the only disagreement we had was your total embracement of total socialism or Marxism. That was what the argument was. That's an unmitigated disaster. All attempts to get there have proven to be an unmitigated disaster. And a bunch of young people that didn't live through Marxism and the attempts to it are the only people that think that it's a good idea. Anyone who's lived through it understands that it's a disaster. Real quick on the solutions, we can have international bodies and things that do things. If we, the individuals, don't decide to start taking actions ourselves and as consumers adopt and go after products that we think are done in an ethical standard, then I'm afraid all this will fall on its face, because we could see that even currently that the government's inept to handle these things. I'm sorry, Joe, I don't buy that Nike is going to solve the problem. They're going to look into the slave labor. I'm sure they'll figure it out. Again, the last thing I'll say is I feel that the people in charge of the left and even people in this panel, they embrace these corporations when they're going after the right. And if you would actually stand up and say, no, we're not going to embrace you, even when you're going after the right, then maybe things would change. But you won't do it.
I let you go way,
so sorry,
way more, but you got a lot to respond to, so that's fine. But okay, so we will go on to our next topic. Oh man, yeah, I thought we were having a good time. Layman does not agree.
I had a great time. Fuck Layman, all right? I haven't had a capitalism versus socialism debate, and if chat didn't like it, fuck them too.
Okay. All right. Okay, so now we're on the right path. Yeah, screw Canadians. All right, moving on. Okay. Next topic. One I'm pretty sure you guys can fight about too. Next topic. Police unions have been roundly criticized and Police unions have roundly criticized and denounced Derek Chauvin. Some even welcomed his conviction. But should police unions be trusted by the public at all? Is this just a PR stunt to blunt reform of their profession? And if police are an impediment to reform, should they be dismantled? Police unions. I put police. I meant police unions. Sorry about that. But police unions, should they be dismantled?
So first, quick hot take. Police are not workers. What happens when unions organize strikes? The police come bust them up. Police unions are not part of international or national workers unions generally. They're not workers.
Okay,
we'll fight about that.
So we'll go. Don't to raise your hand. Everyone's gonna get a 1 minute open, and I mean 1 minute, guys. Not like last time. 1 minute, motherfuckers. Okay, all right, Joe.
Oh, I wish this was different because my opinion was the police. All right, so police unions' responses are mixed in the local and national situations, right? So like the fraternal order, the police called on Donald Trump to urge his supporters to disperse on January 6th. Then contrast that with in Philadelphia, Lodge 5 did not invite Proud Boys to their Back in Blue after party following a Mike Pence rally, but they didn't ask them to leave either. And then even in the case of Derek Chauvin, they called the trial and that they called the trial fair, and the due process was served. So I think police unions are working as intended, and PR statements and actions rarely lead to policy changes. If we're looking at law enforcement, it never has happened. There's a quick side thing. I think police dismantlement won't work and is something that some groups are advocating as a center policy that I will never support or advocate for. And I'm more than happy to expand on specific policy changes that I support. If that's something that people want to know.
Hogan, 1 minute.
Yeah, I think Socrates touched on it, but police are not members of the working class. Their fundamental purpose in modern society, particularly the U.S., is to protect the interests of wealthy people and the interests of property owners. This is not to say police should be abolished. That's not my position. I think police do serve a role in modern society. There are a set of reforms I can talk about when the panel opens up that will bring them closer to the interests of the working class as opposed to what I just said, the property owning class. But the gist is, in their current form, anytime workers try to do these PR stunts like unionize, or, there's some high profile case of police abuse that they publicly protest. The point is, I think it's fair to say this is just entirely done for optics reasons. This country has a long and storied history of police abuse towards both minorities and, the dominant ethnicity. So we definitely need to reform them to bring them closer to worker interests.
Connor.
Okay, so police unions serve two basic functions, and I think one of those is okay, and what the other one can be divorced out, and I won't really give a shit. The first function is to negotiate wages, benefits, and retirement in concert with local government. I think that's the purpose that should stay within police unions. I don't have any problems with that. I don't give a shit about it. The second role is defending police from wrongdoing. I do not care if that is exported to a general insurance where law enforcement officers pay out to a general insurance that just hires them lawyers rather than police union lawyers specifically. Every person who commits a crime is entitled to an aggressive defense. Police are no different. That being said, I think there is a conflict of interest that can get gross when there are lawyers whose exclusive job is to defend cops from consequences for wrongdoing. I don't want to use up my whole minute, but basically police, they do serve a basic social function, and they will be required in the future. Yield.
Just a really, really quick clarification.
Under a minute. And you can clarify during the open panel. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so one, I think it's worth putting out that given the last topic, there's already some irony you can see here. Yes, who would have thought unions look out for their union members? And now we have people saying, well, this union right out of the gate, the first union we're specifically talking about after embracing Marxism and co-ops and things like that is, oh, there's a problem with this union. Well, yes, there are going to be. This is what you would expect. I agree with counterpoints. The first part of the union, I have no problem with whatsoever. The second part where he's talking about defending themselves, but that's inevitable. Right? Any union, if I was a member of a union, for example, I knew people that were a member of a steelworkers union. Guess what happened if they got in some sort of legal trouble pertaining their job? Their union protected them and hired lawyers. That's the gist of every union. And we would expect when you unionize labor, that's one of the things you're unionizing for. Not just your wages, not just your worker condition, but also protection in the field of legal problems. And the last thing I'll say is, in a world where we've demonized police to the point where it's outrageous, I'm not surprised that we see unions that are defending police. They should defend police more aggressively because it is an absolute outrage what we see people trying to do and blame police for in this country. There are reforms that are necessary that could take place, but it's nowhere near as bad as what it's said to be. So expect unions to continue to be forceful because they have to push back against the dominant narrative.
Thank you. Next, Agent 10.
Yeah, so the whole idea that unions to protect their workers, I get that. It's fine, but my problem is when you protect bad workers that hurt the populace. So same thing, hot take is why teachers unions suck. Sorry, Joe Lewis. It's when you protect really shitty workers that hurt the populace or hurt anyone else. But then again, also police unions should be a thing for like what Connor said, talk about wages, benefits, retirement, et cetera. But also this is the first time I've ever heard that police aren't workers, so I don't know where the hell that came from, but they definitely do work. Rest I yield my time.
Marxist talking point.
Okay. Layman.
Yeah, cops are workers. They do a lot of fucking insane fucking work. Calling them not workers is like demeaning as shit. And even under like some Marxist definition, they don't own means of production, which would technically make them workers. So that talking point just really pisses me off. But second of all, as for unions and the actual topic, I support police unions. I support many, many different unions. I'm actually a pretty pro-union guy. Not like absolutely, but you know, a lot of good shit from unions. I want cops to be able to negotiate for better wages for their workers and for better salaries for their workers. That's what I want to do because I'm pro-worker. Now, as far as what Connor mentioned earlier, I agree with everything Connor said and what Rob and H alluded to, which is that there are
10 seconds.
Yeah, sorry. There is a problem with cops not being held accountable for shit, and I would like to open that up a little bit so they can get fucking fired a little bit easier. Okay, a little reductionist, but yeah.
And finally, Maddie.
Yeah, I think I agree with Connor's point that there are two main functions of a police union, and one assumes the role that you would most normally associate with a union doing collective bargaining, that sort of thing. But one issue I take, and this is across unions, is when unions then try to prevent any sort of meaningful reform, in this case, like a police union preventing any sort of measures that enact accountability on police officers, they use their political clout to prevent that from happening. And I do take issue with that. And that's why it's hard for me to take them seriously when they condemn Derek Chauvin, because his actions are the exact same thing that they have worked tirelessly to allow to happen with impunity. So they are problematic.
Okay. Open to the panel.
Yeah, if I could just really quickly clarify, police are workers. They're not capitalists. They're within the class of workers. The task that they perform, a large portion of the time, is contrary to the interests of workers generally, right? So what they do is an enforcement arm of the state. If there's a protest that needs broken up, if there's people striking for better pay, it's the police who come and break them up and stop them. So one part of the job that they perform ends up being contrary directly to all other workers. But the police people themselves are workers. They're not capitalists.
Yeah, but if they're violating the law within those protests, if they're rioting or something like that, then yeah, I would want the cops to stop that. But as far as protesting in and of itself, that's protected under the law. It's called freedom of speech. So people are exercising the freedom of speech. There's like their job is to uphold the law. Then I don't understand how that equates to them like, oh no, they're the ones who stop protesting. Like it's
I really want to get out of this like minimalistic idea.
Basic strikes or riots.
Like I gotta like this is gonna get so fucking like ridiculous. So let's center this a little bit. Do you think the police union should support the idea of redistributing police duties to specialists trained in those areas?
Oh, can I jump in?
Sure.
So basically, not necessarily. But at the same time, I think there are some ideas. So for instance, if this was not within the context of defunding, right? Oftentimes the reasons why people are resistant to reform, as was pointed out, I think this goes across unions completely, steel workers, auto workers, all that kind of stuff. The reason why they're resistant to reform is because they want to keep their fucking jobs, right? So if this was expanded out of the context of you're gonna lose employees, but we're going to take the employees that you previously had and we're going to add in these other roles. Why not just add in the other fucking roles? So for instance, one of the things that I think is like most police officers would be down for is basically one, uniformed or ununiformed social worker who was either on call or in a patrol car with the cops. They could wear body armor. They wouldn't necessarily have to be in a uniform. And if there was psych calls, med calls, Baker Acts, all that kind of stuff, they could be the point person for negotiation. This has two effects. One, especially if they were just wearing like a suit, tie, polo, polo and khakis, something like that. There's somebody who does not have a badge and a gun who is on scene, who is communicating with a person in distress. Just by the person communicating being like in a polo and khakis, that can already de-escalate the situation. So that can help the other person feel more comfortable coming in and surrendering. That's number one. Number two, it can also be a psychological relaxation for the cops, because since they're not the point person, let's say that my social worker is Terry, I'm going to let Terry handle that shit until it gets like scary, like until there's bad shit going down. So I can step back, I can relax. And when a guy who is in diabetic shock is telling me that he's going to, fuck my mom with a cinder block, I can just go, all right, Terry's got it. He's going to talk him down. You know what I'm saying? So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Connor, can I so something that I support, and maybe this might be a bridge too far for some people who don't have like decent beyond grade school levels of reading comprehension, is that I want to create the conditions where what we currently know as police doesn't exist in communities. Now, on that face, it sounds like, whoa, you're gonna bring it down and put it back up. It's like, no, like, hang on a second. Like, one of the biggest qualms of the Thin Blue Line movement is that like police are overworked, and I agree with that. So something that I think that you allude to is that there are certain roles that you and I could probably agree that officers shouldn't be dealing with in the first place. Because if I agree that in the teacher profession, one of the things in our training modules is that we're not trained or educated to handle every situation in a classroom, then I should also agree that that would exist in a myriad of other professions. And I'll give you
an example, and then I'll shut up so I don't dominate.
Yeah, and then real quick, and then what happens is we see that bridging into other fields of expertise that could be circumvented or altered by just having, like you said, like a healthcare worker in there, maybe even like an officer who is a responder within the EMT. And just so we're clear, right?
Yes.
Like this already happens in other areas of government and in the country. Like, look no different. Like, there's a reason why in the criminal justice system, sexually based offenses are considered especially heinous, because there's an idea that there's a type of officer that's designed to handle this in a way that you might consider better than just a beat cop. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. 2 points, and then I'll yield so I don't dominate the conversation. One, I was talking about this with other cops. It would be super cool to have an EMT in the car with you, because cops are trained in like basic emergency medical response, but firefighters and EMTs are chilling at like a base. So their response time is like 5 to 7 minutes. So actually somebody in the car, cops can still do like initial emergency medical work, but having somebody there, you're basically cutting the response time by maybe a few minutes. You could actually save people that you're not currently saving. And then my second thing, and then I'll shut up for a while, is truancy. Law enforcement officers should not be involved in truancy, going to a middle schooler or a high schooler's house and saying, fuck you, listen to your mom, or I'm going to beat your ass and drag you to school. That should be a school administrator trained in the role, trained in de-escalation, trained with difficult kids. And the only time a cop should be on that scene is if violence is occurring because of that conflict. And then I'll yield and I'll actually be back. I'm gonna go get some water.
Okay.
Can I just make a quick point?
Okay. Hogan and then Rob.
I just want to make a quick point regarding what Socrates and Layman were talking about at the beginning. The whole point that we're trying to establish here is whether, hopefully, if police being in unions would be ultimately beneficial for the greatest number of people in the communities they're supposed to serve. Socrates alluded to this already, but when you say something, when you get a statement like police aren't workers, right? Again, obviously they are not capitalists. They are constitutive of the working class, as he pointed out, but their primary function in society, unfortunately, is to protect property rights. The entire existence of private property necessitates that there's somebody who has the capacity of protecting that property if it's endangered or threatened. Ultimately, that reduces to the police force, and trust me, we don't need to like comb through the historical record to intuitively know that police are more than happy to step outside the bounds of the law if it's necessary for the people that own that property. So the point is, when I say something, and I would assume Socrates agrees, correct me if I'm wrong, when I say something like we need to move police closer to the interests of the working class, I'm not suggesting they don't work, right? That's not what I'm proposing. I'm suggesting something like they need to either come from or be a part of the broader labor working class that we were referring to earlier in order to be less incentivized to protect the property rights of people who are ultimately capitalists, thus acting against the interests of working class interests almost all the time. And they need to be more in line with the interests of the working class so that it's not a question of them protecting property, it's a question of them actually serving the interests of the largest economic class that exists in this country.
Rob, layman, and agent.
I'll just address that real quick. Yes, we know communists are against property. Property rights are important. I want the police protecting my property, giving police...
Not against property, some quick
force. Giving the state the monopoly on force is one of the smartest things humanity's ever done. I don't want vigilantes protecting their own property because the police aren't doing that. Though I do agree that we need to reform how... I would like to see a turn to more community policing and things like that. Things like civil forfeiture laws are grotesque. I think that they're one of the most disgusting things we could see, but that's because I value personal property, and the police shouldn't have the right to take away your personal property.
We're not talking about personal property, Rob.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Anyways,
no, let him
to
finish,
talk about
finish, please.
Right, I'm not even interested in this conversation. So to talk about kind of where like this idea. So Jocko Willink, someone I really like. I don't know if you all watch Joe Rogan's podcast. I catch it once in a blue moon. Jocko Willink is someone who was an MMA fighter, and he was also a Navy SEAL. He talks about when he trained as a SEAL, 90% of a mission was training. So if they were going to be on a mission for 5 days, they would train for that specific mission for like 90 to 180 days. And he says that's the big problem with policing, that we police like 5% of their jobs training. They're stretched thin. They're out there all the time, and they're in situations that they're not trained for. Now, to Joe and counterpoint, I'm not disagreeing that like maybe we could have ride-alongs and things like that. But two things. One, that's going to require a massive increase in funding, not defunding, as we hear a lot of people suggest that the solution would be defunding. But secondly, you have to ask if it's redundant anyways. Would we be better? Because no matter what, all of these situations, like let's just play this out in the real world. You would want, let's say there's some, I personally deal with home health care with people with disabilities, autism, and things like that. I've been called out to calls many a time where there was a person who's autistic that was engaged in what we would consider a violent incident. However, I have to go there with a law enforcement agent. I have to, because I'm not trained, nor am I legally allowed to put my hands on anyone. So I can't restrain someone. So if I show up to an autistic person's house and they're beating their mother, I can't do anything. Law enforcement needs to be there. Look at a situation like a domestic disturbance. These are one of the most dangerous calls that police could get called out on. What are we going to do? Send just a social worker? Well, I assume most people would say, well, no, you send the police officer with them. Okay, but would it be more fruitful to make sure that for one police, each department in this country has to have like 10% of them be social workers? That's a massive cost. Or would it be better to say, if we need someone that could use force, i.e. the police officer, let's invest in training for them and make sure that like only 50% of their jobs on the beat, and the other 50% is training, not just how to deal with these different situations, but also mental health training from the stress of the job and things like that. And in that training, I think if you're doing that much training, you would be able to weed out the worst officers. Like, for example, some moron that thinks that her taser's a gun, right? If you went through a more rigorous training, you would either train people so those things don't happen or be able to weed them out. So it's going to require massive investment. But I do agree, we should be spending much more money training police officers. I'm not opposed to having other sorts of workers right along with them, but you'll always need that police. And so I don't know that it solves the problem that a lot of people have. There's still going to be someone using force.
I want to respond to that directly because
I'll be real quick. I just want to push.
Will you be real quick?
Let's hope. Yeah.
That's like when I say I'll be real quick. I'm like,
I want to push. I want to push back on a comment. I want to push back on a comment you made at the beginning. It's not really fair to represent anything that I've said or presumably anything else said by anybody on this panel as opposition to property. I don't know why you said that. The opposition isn't to property. The opposition is to protection of private property in the interests of a particular class of people, which is exactly what I said. You seem to have a problem with misrepresentation.
No, I think that the police should protect, but they protect my private property. And what I see is a problem of police being told
I'm
to
not
stand
talking about your view. I'm talking about what you said about
That's
my view.
anecdotal, yeah.
Right. Your view
Oh
is
my
nonsensical,
God.
and it's not true. So,
Can
I'm
we
just
not?
telling you that you
Coming to your
misrepresented the
property.
view I
Holy
had.
shit.
This is semantic
Yeah.
bullshit.
All right, yeah,
That's-
so
Brian,
Rob,
can I go?
Rob
Joe,
addressed me
then layman,
directly.
then agent.
Yeah, fair enough,
And
Joe.
Connor.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so like Rob, like these are the three things I support. So just that I can make this as clear as possible. I want to divest from police and invest in services that prioritize health and safety. I also want to redistribute police duties to specialists trained in those areas. And I also want the reevaluation of what a crime is. And I think these three things need to happen simultaneously. And I don't think you would be an objection to those things.
well,
I
yeah,
am.
I am. Like, you can't divest from. Again, this is the problem I have with that. In order to have the training and the social workers and things, that's going to be a massive investment, not divestment. And
You invest in those things, Rob.
let's just do a specific example. Domestic disturbance call. Who you sending, Joe Lewis?
It could be a myriad of things. It could be a social worker with an officer. It could
Okay,
be a social. It
but
could be a social worker with an
Let him
officer
finish,
with an
Rob.
EMT.
Let him finish.
Because again, if I understand, if as you know, as a professional, as am I, if there is an incident with somebody who has an IEP in a school, there's three people who come: a social worker, a police officer, and also an EMT. This is something that already exists in school systems. So we
Okay,
understand that
that's not-
professionals do
police
different things.
That's not a divestment from police. That is having the same officer show up. He just has two additional people. with him.
Rob, but hold on, you're not understanding. You're tackling one part of it without all of it. I'm talking about divestment. So we're very clear here: divestment from police and investment that in services that prioritize health and safety. Do you disagree with the divestment alongside the investment in services that prioritize health and safety?
Absolutely, 100%. Divesting.
Okay, why exactly do you feel that investment in services that prioritize health and safety is a bad thing?
He doesn't. It's just the divestment part. It's the
He
same
never said
objection I
that.
have.
He's just
No,
like, take away money
here's the
bad.
thing. Here's the thing. If we understand,
Which it is.
if we understand that that is prohibitively expensive, right? If we understand that that is
No.
expensive, why not begin with the over expenditures within police budgets and ask for a better transparency of those things at the local level?
I'll leave someone else respond.
So-
I have a response, but I can.
I mean, that's
Okay.
a question that you can answer, I think.
If you want me to answer, I'll answer. It's because we already see a problem with lack of law enforcement, right? That's potentially the problem. So we're talking about law enforcement being stretched too thin. In these areas where you're talking about, we're still going to need law enforcement officers to be there. So if
Which
the
is-
addition of a social worker comes at the expense of less officers, then the problem will just be exacerbated and won't be solved.
No, but this is why these three things have to
God
happen
damn it, Joe. Okay,
simultaneously.
interjection. Holy
Okay.
shit.
No. So we'll
I
go
can fix
to don't layman, agent, Maddie, Connor, because then it's just gonna be lots of objections. So finish like Joe. I said quick, and then the opposite of quick, of course. Are you done?
Sure.
Are you done?
This is a longer. This requires a much longer back and forth.
Okay. All right. We can try to get back to it later. So layman, excuse me.
Oh, I will.
I'll try to pivot back into it actually, because I think what I wanted to say earlier will. So I'm going to address this really quick, and then I'm just going to lay this to rest because I know that it was a pivot at the beginning. I don't like the Mott and Bailey of being told cops aren't workers, and then when I say cops are workers, then they agree that cops are workers, and then they tell me, but what we actually mean is a different position. So that fucking annoys the fuck out of me. I hate Mott and Bailey's from like leftists and shit. It annoys the fuck out of me.
Clarified
And that's
exactly
it.
what
And
we
that's
meant.
it. And that's
we
just,
gotta move
Hogan,
on.
just
Sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, just that's all I want to say about that, and I want to get to the more policy discussion that Joe and Connor are talking about. So I think so something that I know a lot of people support, both citizens and cops, is more like body cams and shit like that. And I think that in and of itself is something that would have to increase police funding. Now, there's mixed evidence right now as to whether or not that is particularly effective. There's a lot of studies that show it is. There's a lot of studies that show that it doesn't make things worse, but it's not necessarily a statistically significant effect. But stuff like body cams on every cop seems to be something that is a good thing to pursue. So, and I think with the anti-defund crowd, or I know you didn't say defund, you said a different word, where reallocate.
Divestment.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
want me to just say I've talked about this all the time. Divest from police and invest in services that prioritize health and safety, while at the same time redistribute police duties to specialists trained in those areas and reevaluating what should be considered a crime. I want all three of these things simultaneously, not one in a vacuum.
Okay,
That's a
good.
whole lot of words for nothing.
Whoa, what? Not at all.
Well, no, I think Joe. I think I agree with Joe on that. You know, it's kind of abstract, but I agree with it. Like the principles of it for sure. I just I think maybe the divesting part is coming off as, I'm not going to speak for the righties. Just correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like what they are saying is, or what they're thinking is like divest means defund. I think that's coming off as like synonymous. But if I'm misrepresenting you guys, feel free to dunk on me. But I think there's some things that might, there's some police reform. Yeah, there's some like police reform that might require an increase in funding. So that's, I think, where the contention is.
Okay, here's an example.
I was talking to Joe. I want Joe,
because that's my belief.
Yeah, that was to Joe, so Joe should respond to that. Yeah.
If I were to use the word defund, I would use the word defund. I use the word divest because I'm talking about divestment and investment. I'm not talking exclusively.
Define the fucking terms so I know what it means. Holy shit. Get literally just google.com divest and just say what it means.
Okay, we can rid oneself of something that one no longer wants or requires.
Sure.
Such as a business interest or an investment.
Okay,
so we can evaluate. I can elaborate. Right? I can elaborate in this, right?
You don't need to. You just need to tell me if it's responsibility or money. What are we talking about?
It's money.
Okay, then we're talking about defucking fund. Okay.
No. Do not do this, Connor. You are way too smart to be this much of a fifth grader on this.
Then can I give you my objection?
You understand as much as I do that police do over expenditures in areas they do not need resources in.
Which
and
one?
Then what happens in my district is body cameras. We overinvest in that. Another issue is that our vehicles are over expenditures. And then when our council challenges those expenditures, they validate it by saying things that are very ambiguous, like, well, we don't know our anticipation of certain things moving over into the next year, and other type of language like that. Every department might have different types of expenditures, but you would agree that the actual, when you look at reports of police budgeting, a lot of the times it's incredibly ambiguous. So we don't even know what they're spending for in the first place, unless you disagree with that.
Okay.
And Joe, that's like a use it or lose it funding.
I would like to go because I think that was directed at me.
You know what? No. Because what's going to happen is we're going to bounce around. We're now going to get to Agent and Maddie. So Agent and Maddie, and then Connor. You can wait. All right, Agent.
Maddie hasn't said shit.
Cool. So divestment's just a fancy term for defunding. Cool. So have I, Maddie. Nice. You
Same with you, mate. Same with you, Agent. Same with you.
Divest.
Agent, please. Let him go.
Yeah, so divestment being just a fancy word for defund at this point. No, you don't take money away from police. If you want more training, I don't know how you have a body cam problem. I'm also from Jersey. Ship them up towards me, man. Please fucking do.
Right? We tried in your area, rejected it. If you looked at the news anytime on NJ.com. That was a story that was covered last year. I can source you the stuff.
That's stupid then. Okay, point being that you still don't defund them. You give them more money to get this training, for more EMT training, for more counseling training, or hell, even add counselors to the roster of police so we can have these, fucking drive-ins or the fuck, whatever the hell it was called. So for medical checkups and everything like that, you don't defund them. I think your whole divestment thing is just, you pussyfooting around. No, we cannot defund police. Chat, it's also a stupid idea. So I really don't understand why you're trying to play semantics and choose a different word.
I'm making sure my words are direct with what I exactly mean, so you can approach the idea appropriately.
Joe,
I'm never talking about defunding in my argument.
Agent, I making sure Agent's.
Yeah, I yield.
Okay, Maddie, and then Connor.
Great. So I think what we're all thinking about is, well, how do we ensure accountability with the police? And given the amount of responsibility that's on the shoulders of our police departments, especially when you think about how other services that used to be offered have been systematically defunded and removed, and then that responsibility has been reallocated to the police department where we're expecting them to do everything. Here's the truth. For people that join police departments, largely They join because they want to serve and protect. But we also know that people who are part of marginalized communities get disproportionately targeted, and the police are more often used as a force to protect the interests of the wealthy than they are to actually make communities safer. So you might ask yourself, well, what the hell do we do about it? And I have a few prescriptions that I would like to, bring out into the open. So my first one would be to end qualified immunity, because that would ensure accountability and hold bad actors responsible for their action, someone like a Derek Chauvin. Another thing I would like to see happen is establishing a federal standard for the use of force. Because when cities employ more restrictive policies for police use of force, they improve both community trust and officer safety. So if we had a federal standard that could not only be enforced and have oversight conducted by the DOJ, but also we could empower state attorney generals to also conduct that oversight. I think we should increase federal funding for law enforcement training. I think we need to militarize local law enforcement, as I think Joe Lewis kind of alluded to. The fact that our police that are supposed to be, again, serving the community and making our community safer are essentially dressed up as if they're going into war. I think that works aversely to what their ultimate goal is. So let's demilitarize the police. Let's add more social workers to their ranks so that during mental health crises or things like truancy can be handled by someone who isn't armed, and someone who is specially trained to handle those situations. Those are my solutions that I share with you, incredibly beautiful geniuses.
Okay, all right. She was just talking to me. Counterpoints, and counterpoints, and it's going to be Socrates and Pogan.
All right, beautiful. So I appreciate you guys. All right, so my objection to divestment specifically. Okay, I don't give a fuck if you divest from law enforcement a decade from now or 2 decades from now. But there's basically security theory, okay? Power abhors a vacuum. Security also abhors a vacuum. Whenever we talk about security conflicts like Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever, basically what we're talking about is we're talking about power vacuums. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to cut down on the security apparatus until the things that are meant to take their place are up and running. So if you were saying, hey, Connor, let's invest in the community first. Let's improve our schools. Let's do universal pre-K. Let's try to fix broken families. Let's have counselors. Let's have counselors on the fucking police department. Let's have firefighters, EMS embedded with law enforcement. Let's build up this surrounding infrastructure that is going to support the weight that is going to be taken off when we start cutting down on officers. Then I would support that buildup, because basically what you're doing is you're building a scaffolding around law enforcement where potentially in the future you might see crime rates dip. At which point, if you see crime rates dip, you can start taking officers off, because you've basically proven that you no longer fucking need them. Japanese and Italian cops sit around all day with their hands on their dicks, not because they're lazy pieces of shit, they might be, but also because they have nothing to do, because they're working in relatively functional societies. I hate saying that about Italians. I'll probably take it back once I find out more about Italy. All right. Interests of the wealthy. This is really weird to me, okay? Maybe in like New York, California, San Francisco, like super cities, that's fucking true, because they're like protecting their like local Starbucks or the local Apple store or something like that. But at the same time, in a community of 15,000, which was a community that I worked in the community of 200,000, the community that that is nearest to me, basically what cops do is a few things that are actually worthwhile, which is prevent burglary. We're preventing your cars from getting stolen from. We're preventing vandalism, so small businesses and large businesses from getting destroyed. We're preventing homicide, so people getting killed, which I think is part of our purview. And no matter how bad people are, you want to prevent them from getting killed. And then we're also preventing, so it was like burglary. Oh, and then auto accidents, which, by the way, you are infinitely more likely to be killed in an auto accident than you are in a homicide, whether that's committed by police or a member of the public. So those are all responsibilities that I am completely okay for. Addressing Maddie's points really quickly. I just want to explain this to the audience because I don't think they know. And qualified immunity, this is something that Pisco actually said. Qualified immunity is exclusively for civil suit. I oppose Maddie, but I would want to qualify that in a broader statement, which I won't do now. Qualified immunity just opens up people to civil suit. And if you still had law enforcement officers as open to civil suit as anybody else, all you're doing is you're taking like the costs of like, you're just passing those costs off to the city. If you want cities to be able to be sued and pay out tens of millions of dollars and also put money in the pockets of lawyers like Pisco 95, then have fucking at it. But I still think it's creating a fucked up society. Two final points. Federal standards for use of force. I don't think you can impose federal standards. I think you can create federal standards and then incentivize that through grant programs like the community-oriented policing program and also the military policing. I'm going to leave it there because I know I've been ranting a lot, but I would love to talk about demilitarization in a second because I think it's completely misunderstood. It is not the tool and the equipment that is the problem. The tools that law enforcement officers have are needed. It's how they are applied. Specific example, the overuse of SWAT teams. Yield.
Socrates and Pogan.
Yeah, so I definitely want to try to approach everybody on the panel in terms of where they're at and try to reach them where they are. So like counterpoints, Rob Noor, definitely not generally kind of on the same page with the rah leftist defund the police. And I think the first thing in terms of giving you exactly what you want, which is to look at, I'm going to say which city, but my city in terms of the budget changes, which is basically that they have they've had roughly the same budget or budget increases, and what that's gone to is overtime, and what they've slashed is it's the Bureau of Professional Development and the Bureau of Investigative Services. Basically, that's the anti-corruption unit that makes sure that there's no shady deals going on within the police, and it's the training. So they're slashing the training as well. Police overtime is the sixth largest. If it were its own department, it would be the sixth largest like city budget expense, like 1.7 times like the Cabinet of Operations, which comprises like 17 different departments. And so totally with you there on counterpoints in terms of like there's like police address crime after it's happened. And the kind of like investment that would be awesome is ways to prevent crime before it happens by building a time machine or some kind of telepaths who could by trying to get people better city situations. So getting people off the street into homes, getting more public services that help people so that they don't end up turning to a life of crime. As Joe Lewis said, in terms of limiting the scope in certain sense of what the police end up having to do, whether that's in terms of the calls or certainly we can probably mostly all agree here, kind of ending the war on drugs. Finally, can we all get together and like say, pressure Biden, like fucking just end this shit. Just take weed off of like fucking Schedule 1 or whatever it is. That's like insane. Like let everybody go who's in jail for like just possession or like small amounts of dealing, have those records expunged. That's a huge thing that police spend a huge amount of time and it generates crime. That seems like an easy thing we can all agree on. And then in terms of maybe something in terms of enforcing that police departments have to spend their budgets more toward professional development and anti-corruption.
Yeah, so really briefly, the way that you get rid of the overtime budget is you hire more officers. So you actually, yield.
Well, they're doing both currently, but
and we'll go to Pogan, then Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I have a brief comment because I need to go do some IRL stuff, so I'll be dipping out after this statement. But I mean, my position is basically the same as Socrates' and Maddie's for the most part. At the beginning of this, I said that a big way to curb police abuse would be to bring them closer to the interests of the working class. But more specifically and more narrowly than that, I think, as Joe was pointing out, there is just massive over expenditures in police budgets. I think a lot of money that police spend could be dialed back and more efficiently spent on things that are actually either beneficial, as Socrates was saying, in terms of the cultural and professional development of police forces, and then secondarily, better spent in terms of enriching communities, providing various professional or social services that most police forces don't currently provide. The militarization of the police is a huge problem that I think is largely done in response to riots. I know we talked about that the last time I was on the panel, but I think that's something that not only drives up budgets for police departments, but also makes them more closed off to the interests of their community. They start to operate less as a police force and less as a community service, more of like a paramilitary force deployed just to stop people from doing things, not to be weird, but the elites don't want them doing, for lack of a better term. So I think these are all very good suggestions, and I think it's something that can absolutely be approached in a gradual way through very careful reforms. I think police officers as individuals do have a lot to offer their communities. It's just as an institution in their current form, they do a lot of harm, largely due to the nature of who they serve and the nature of how militarized they've become. But that's been me. I need to dip out and do some IRL stuff now, so I appreciate coming on and talking to you guys as always.
Thank you for being here.
Nice to meet you, man.
Absolutely. See ya.
It was fun.
Let's go to Joe.
IRL stuff. Gross.
Yeah. Let's go to Joe.
Yeah, so Connor, something that happens a lot when we're on these panels is that we talk past each other when we're usually a bit more aligned on this. Because everything that you described, so something that happened in my 3 sort of like step-by-step processes is that these things aren't immediate things, right? And you understand as well as I do. And I would never support the full divestment on like a very like on its face at day 0. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So then what happens is, as you described, is that these situations are 5, 10, 15, 20-year programs for the eventuality of reimagining what police looks like. So everything you described in terms of how like different officers respond to scenes, like all those prescriptive stuff that you did, that's stuff that I support, and that's within that. But like I guess what happened was, in interest of time, is that it's like those were the 3 things that like kind of like I want this, this, and this. Then from there, there's prescriptive policies that lead into that. Because a big proponent within that, which is why I said they all have to happen at the same time, is reevaluating what should be considered a crime in the first place. And then that way, on top of the redistribution of police duties and the divestment and reinvestment of services, you'll start to see, as you described, like, okay, where do we need a police officer in these situations? And then that way, over time, it's not going to be a burden on the tax dollar. Because one of my concerns is that if you were to go to a council meeting and advocate a policy and say, like, we're going to reinvest in policing for the goal of prioritizing health and safety, if at any point implies some type of tax increase, a lot of communities will push back on that immediately, especially in rural and it's more like suburban traditional areas. We're like, wait a minute, especially in my state, right? They'll say, wait, we're already paying too much in taxes. So when I argue divestment, it's like, okay, let's reimagine what our funding is for that. And then if we need a justification to increase our taxes to serve a certain thing, then it's a much easier argument, because it's like, okay, we did the divestment part, we did the investment part, but we still need funding for this thing. And then that's a much smaller tax burden. Instead of being like 1 to 3%, you're talking about like certain like small percentiles of distribution. Does that make sense?
It does. And Prime, I do have a response, but I want to let Rob go, and then I want to jump in after him, basically.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So there's 2 problems. Still, then you're talking about future divestment. That's antithetical to what we see today, which is people calling for immediate defunding of police departments. That is an unmitigated disaster. So if you're saying you disagree with that, that's fine. But I have something to say, but I do want to ask you about something you just said. You say reimagine what it means to be a crime. Okay, we had one example, war on drugs, marijuana. I think everyone on this panel, as far as I'm concerned, seemed to suggest, yeah, it's out of control. The war on drugs. I think we have an over-incarceration and an under-incarceration problem in this country. Over-incarceration with non-violent crimes like drug use and stuff like that. Under-incarceration with violent criminals. So my question is, other than the war on drugs, what exactly do you mean reimagine what we define as a crime? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Gosh, there's certain procedures that can happen during an eviction that can lead you to getting arrested. There's certain procedures in terms of conduct of individuals, like interpersonal conduct. So like there's so many and again, like we can talk about this in elaboration way deeper about different nonviolent crimes, but the biggest one in the face for a lot of people is marijuana. I think that's probably the best example that we could do in the context of this conversation.
Okay, so fair enough. And I will say, like, maybe some area of agreement here would be this. Like, I one time got arrested for disorderly conduct because I was at a concert and I was hammered and there was a mosh pit and I got blamed. But I wasn't. Anyways, so the first officer that arrested me was a jerk. The second officer that processed me, real cool. And he was like, it's a misunderstanding. You should fight this. And I was like, what am I being charged for? And he's like, disorderly conduct and drunk in public. I was like, disorderly conduct? I didn't do anything. He's like, read the statute. Yes, you did. You commit disorderly conduct every day. That's the way the statute's written, because we could just, if we want you on something and we can't get you, we'll just be like, okay, disorderly conduct. Literally, like, it's like, basically in Pennsylvania, it's like someone could consider what you did a nuisance. Well, the tone of my voice is considered a nuisance to many people, so that technically I broke the law. So, you know,
or even like noise citations, right? Like if you're having like an argument with some, like if you and I were like in a beer, which I'm hoping one day we can all have like a beer powwow, and then we're just in our backyard just fucking around arguing about states' rights, and then a cop just comes up and says, "Hey guys, can you keep it down?" It's like, okay, that's just a high point of a conversation that a bypasser looked on, and now there's like 5 cops in front of the spot.
Right. So I agree in that sense. I get, but I think that's a very small amount of what police do. And and let me be clear: in the areas that we're noticing people saying there's problem with policing, it's not that type of stuff, right? We're talking about areas of this country that have serious violent crime problems, serious ones. And that's where we see the majority of incidents that are appalling to people. Because if there is more violent crime, there's more likely for police to justifiably and unjustifiably use violence in response, right? So I think what I see is, and I'm just going to come right out and say this, right? I think that not only do we criminally underpay police officers, particularly in those areas that are putting their life on the line, like we're talking about police officers starting at $40,000 a year in places like New York City. That shit is crazy. You could make that in Walmart almost at some places. You're going to put your life on the line like for that. But now we've taken an added step, and that's why I kind of have, I don't want to say problems, but the context of the way this question was worded, it shows me the second problem, which is we're demoralizing police. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't criticize bad officers like Chauvin when they do something we disagree with, but I think that there is this movement where almost every institution of power in this country, the dominant narrative is these police are shitty. For example, I have a poll up that shows 47% of liberals thought that police shot and killed over 1,000 unarmed black men in 2020. The actual number is 24. Right? There's this narrative that police are these horrible, racist, terrible people. And my concern is with the suggestions of defunding or divestment, with the poor money they're already receiving, and with the demoralization, who the hell in their right mind is going to want to be a police officer in the future? And it's going to be a serious problem. We already see homicides and violent crimes in areas where we've defunded police or demoralized police. We already see homicides are going up to records we haven't seen since the 90s. So I think we're in for a dark future if we don't start investing more in law enforcement, holding those accountable that behave poorly, but stop painting with a broad brush the entire agency.
All right. I would like to jump in because I think I was going after Rob. So for instance, Joe, like literally, if you wanted to do a one-on-one Discord call at some point and I could actually run you through the vehicle shit and like whether or not your cops are bullshitting, I wouldn't mind doing that. Because basically there are concerns with law enforcement officers where our vehicles burn out faster, 50,000 miles, 70,000 miles. Our brakes are shot to shit. The fucking thing's goddamn falling apart because we run it harder than people fucking just driving a normal thing.
You don't want to... You don't want to know what vehicles they have either.
By the way,
okay, is it Crown Victorias? Because Crown Victorias are beautiful.
No, they don't have Crown Victorias.
V8?
No, they have. Let me look it up.
I'm a former law enforcement officer.
Okay,
So basically, like, I literally wouldn't mind breaking that down for you and letting you know whether or not they're bullshitting you. Also, I think that this is a little bit different because I'm in Florida. Public programs tend to run a little lean, so we're fighting like city departments for like for updated body armor because we're using old like hand-me-downs. We're fighting for fucking new cars, and the old cars have like 110,000 miles on it. Sometimes they're literally being held together by duct tape. So I think that might be a little bit different than like if your municipality is trying to buy new cars every 3 years and they have 30,000 miles on them. I think that might be a little bit different. So, and that's not to say that corruption doesn't exist. That's not to say that that money can't be better spent. And I wouldn't mind helping out with that. I didn't take this into consideration that like you would actually have to increase municipal taxes in order to do what I was suggesting. And as somebody who pays like a 0.00017 millage rate, which is like triple my like next adjoining counties, I don't want my taxes to go up either. So I understand you basically have to work with the money that you already have budgeted. You can't just create money out of fucking nowhere. But that's where I think that is going to have to become a fight where basically it's like, okay, you guys are projected to get 2 new officers this year based off of our union contract for projected growth of the city, rather than adding 2 patrol officers or 2 CID detectives. We are going to add a community health representative social worker who is basically going to be like an EMT, like certified in mental health, who's going to be your primary person on mental health, and then selling that idea to the law enforcement department. And again, I would be very happy to help with this. If I could improve, I don't know if you're like in Camden or some fucking crazy fuck city in fucking New Jersey, but if I can help New Jersey be less shitty, I'd be very happy to help.
Yeah, so pretty goddamn rich.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll still try to help. Yeah, and then I'll just leave it there. But my last point is that like I understand like the militarization of police is kind of I don't want to say it's a meme, but basically like the militarization of police is giving police hard plates that they keep in their trunk. I wore soft armor every single day. Your uncle's hunting rifle could punch through my fucking body armor. My body armor is basically the equivalent of paper. The reason why I have hard plates in my trunk is because if a mass shooter starts fucking taking action with an assault rifle, I need something that might actually stop the bullet. That's number one. When it comes to armored vehicles, I understand armored vehicles are scary, but also some of them, the Lenco Bearcat looks very scary, okay? The Lenco Bearcat is actually an F3, it's 2 F-350s duct taped together and then covered in armor. And then it can start up to stop
we don't
up
have
to
to
50
get all
right, I'll
wrap
it up. Basically, okay, the problem is not the equipment. The problem is the tactics and the overuse of the tactics. So that's what needs to change, not the equipment.
Connor, just so just for sake of transparency and not doxing myself, I put my department's fleet, like the vehicle they use.
Okay.
That's their main vehicle, by the way.
In chat?
VC chat.
Sure.
Okay.
Maddie.
Yeah, no, Connor, I think that is a really good distinction to make. And I agree. Like, I think we should give our police officers the necessary equipment to also ensure their safety, especially when they're responding to something that is extremely dangerous, where they are putting their life at risk. So something like an active shooter situation. So I definitely don't have an issue with that. I guess when I say the militarization of the police, I'm aligned with you on that. It's the tactics and the mentality that go into the way they police. The fact that even that like officers refer to people as civilians as if they are like, you know, combatants in war, and they're like referred to as civilians. In fact, the military has far stricter measures and oversight for how they can interact with civilians on the ground wherever they're deployed than the police do domestically here. I think one thing I would like to see change is, as it stands right now, police departments can buy military equipment, or just essentially like things that are surplus from the military, which is why there are certain departments that own tanks, that own things that I can't foresee a situation, and maybe I'm naive, but I can't foresee a situation where a police department would need military grade weapons to conduct community safety. If a situation in their district or wherever warranted a military grade response, they should call the military rather than expect the police to fill that role. But other than that, I agree, because I do think, I mean, in general, I think the equipment that we give police officers and the support, you know, whatever they use to ensure their own safety, I support making sure that that is, you know, top of the line, that it's safe, and that we're keeping our officers that our officers safe. And if that includes, whatever it's called, hard gear, I really don't have a problem with that.
I'll go ahead, Socrates, and then Rob, and then your face.
Yeah. So just on the issue of military surplus, I looked into this, and please let me know if I'm incorrect. But my understanding is that the military surplus that the police get in the U.S. is generally very, very cheap or free. The military surplus gear, I looked it up. It's like, it might be like $19 for an AR-15. Like, it's like I kind of couldn't believe like what they actually end up, because it's surplus. It's things that have already been produced. They're determined not to be needed, and so they're actually really, really cheap. So maybe kind of like an inconvenient truth for leftist talking points is that like the kind of militarization and the budgeting issues actually don't appear to really be particularly intertwined. Hard agree when it comes to the tactics. There's a couple things that I want to just kind of offer, not to seem like a kind of crazy radical foaming leftist whatever, but just some things to kind of contextualize, like just alternate ways to think about this. So when we think about like the amount of theft when it comes to robberies, this is like an outdated stat, but the number should scale. It's like 140 million. When it comes to the amount of money that is stolen, when it comes to stolen wages, it's 280 million. This is per year. I'm sure this is like 10 years old. Yeah, that's accurate. You can look that up.
What do you mean stolen wages, though? How much we pay police? Is that what you're saying?
No. I mean, just generally. So, like, if you're an employer, you have a contractual agreement to pay your employee a certain amount. These things have been tracked, and like the delta between what you're supposed to pay in terms of your contract and what employers actually pay, just on average across the United States, the sum total of stolen wages. This is like a category of crime that is difficult to prosecute. Obviously, as an employee, it's harder to collect on those. It's about double like theft stolen in terms of what we generally think of robberies. So this is one, in terms of when we think about the way that crimes are enforced, that's an important stat to keep in mind. And then just one other thing to kind of offer, take it if it sounds good to you, don't, radical leftist, whatever. When you think about, this isn't a policy prescription, but just to think about why it might be the case that police year after year get like 6% wage increase, get more and more overtime. Those police making $47K in New York, they might be making an additional $60K in overtime. This is where a huge amount of that's why people end up becoming police, is because you can make a lot in overtime. It's really fucking hard. I'm not shitting on them for that. It's a lot of fucking work. But that's how you end up making that much money. That's how you end up making 200K, 250K as a police officer per year. And so when we think about just stepping back for a moment, trying to kind of calm things a little bit, and just thinking about, like, we have a city. Let's say we're not going to raise taxes because let's not like fuck with anything, right? Let's not make people upset. Like, if we have a certain budget, how are we going to allocate it to best help our citizens? Because we pay for the police. It's a public service that we pay for. What are other ways that we could allocate that? Whether or not we do that or have to do that, it's something that we have to remember that is within our power. We pay the police departments to allocate those funds. It's our money that goes into that. We could give it to other departments. This is something that like city planning determines. So that is within our power to determine where that money goes.
So let's go to Rob and then Connor.
Okay, just 3 points. First, Manny, when you say police officers have tanks, are you talking about Bearcats? Is that what you're talking about? I'm unaware of any.
I couldn't tell you the type of tank. I picture of a tank.
Have a gun, right? When you think tank, you think of something with a big gun, right? The Bearcat, what's commonly referred to as tanks, when you see the media reporting on it, are just armored vehicles. But these aren't armored vehicles to be offensive. These are like for protection of the. I don't understand why people have a problem with this. Like, if it didn't cost you a bunch of money, it's not as if like, oh, now that I have more armor, I'm going to be more offensive. I don't see that. If a cop was going to hit you with their vehicle that doesn't fire bullets, they'd probably do it regardless if it was a cruiser or a Bearcat. So it just seems like language that's loaded to get people to be like, oh my God, cops have tanks. No, they don't. Cops don't have tanks. They have vehicles for personal protection that oftentimes, as Socrates said, they get for very cheap discounts because it's military surplus. The second argument about the stolen wages, I kind of get what you're saying, but here's the problem. And here's something that I think gets lost in this discussion a lot. I'm totally with you. If I was an employee and I got screwed over by a corporation or something, you're damn right I'd be furious. And those people do deserve justice. Get it. But let's not kid ourselves. That's different and requires a different police presence than someone breaking into your home with a gun to steal your possessions, right? It's totally different. And so we still need, like, it's not necessarily the prioritization because how much money is being taken by the white collar criminal versus the, you know, the home burglary. It's that so many things could go wrong and your family are in danger when it's that low level street crime in a way that you're not in danger when it's that white collar crime. That doesn't mean we shouldn't prosecute white collar crime. I agree with you. I think we should go after harsher than we do. But I just think that that's something that oftentimes people lose in the shuffle where it's like, I don't know. I don't live in the inner city. I have some friends that do. I have friends that were law enforcement in the inner city. That level of intensity of I always said the difference is this. If you live in my area and you're a cop, you say, hey, I hope I get back in time for Monday Night Football tonight. If you live in inner city Chicago and you're a cop, you say, I hope I make it back to my family tonight. Like, this is different. And I think that it's time. That doesn't mean we don't call out bad policing when we see it, but we need to stop demonizing police as if there's something horrible they're not needed. Most polling shows, I think the last poll I saw, 63% of people in the African-American community want the same or more policing. So the idea, I'm not saying anyone's saying this here, but the idea that we should, pull back on policing, that's not what the people in these communities feel. They look out and they see war zones in some of these communities. They might want police to behave better or to be differently focused, but the solution's not getting rid of police. That's not the solution. The solution's investing more in them and making sure we get better people that want to police. And that means not just money, but that means what we can as a society to stop demonizing the group as a whole. The last thing I'll say real quick is, like, if we're going to have this focus, and this is me being partisan, but that's fine. Makes for better debate anyways. If we're going to have this focus on militarization, right? Let's be honest. Why did we see riot after riot occur last spring and summer where seemingly the police had to back off? And the reason that was given was, like, for example, de Blasio said in New York, we just didn't have a police force capable of dealing with this problem, right? There's only two possible solutions. One is that de Blasio, and I've had this debate with people on the left, and some admit it, de Blasio wanted the riot to occur because he thought it was bad for Republicans and Trump. That's solution one. But if you don't think that's the solution, and you believe de Blasio that police was ill-equipped to handle that, there are going to be a rash of successful campaigns to get police more military equipment and tactics based on what we saw in those riots, because people will be able to persuade the community at large and professionals that matter. Look, we were outran, we were outgunned. Maybe not physically guns, but we were outgunned in such that there were so many of them. The tactics and the equipment we have, we were unable to deal with these people. And so I think this is an unintended consequence of the people that rioted. Was you're literally, the people that get fed up with the shit are going to say, you know what, fine, give the police more stuff to deal with these people because we're tired of our community being burnt down. And so, I just think it's ironic and it's horrible that that's what it'll come to. But I think you'll see an increased militarization in tactics and equipment based on the riots that we saw.
Okay. Con?
Yeah. So basically, yeah. So I kind of want to bring this up just so lefties can argue a little bit better. The military surplus stuff is surplus, meaning that this was already budgeted and paid for by the military. So basically, what's going on is law enforcement is paying for shipping, basically. And when you're talking about like an AR-15, I get that in a lot of circles, an AR-15 is scary. In most of my circles, an AR-15 is a standard patrol rifle. There's nothing scary about it. It doesn't have any more features than a lot of weapons that are considered very normal, like very normal plinky. Like the Mini 14 is not an assault weapon, and it doesn't have that different of capacities from an AR-15. But the thing that I want to concede to Maddie and to other people who are bringing up militarization, is that aesthetics can lead to mindset shifts. So if you have, I have a gas mask, I feel cooler when I have my gas mask on. If I'm wearing hard armor, I'm like, I'm fucking rolling into it, right? If I got fucking,
Hell
you know,
yeah.
my AR-15
Fuck yeah.
magazines and fucking like everything, like
Fuck
I
yeah.
feel bigger, I feel stronger, you know, like all that kind of shit. So
yeah.
the equipment can shift.
Wait, Connor. I don't mean to cut you off, but
This was like my
But-
second point, but all right.
yeah, but people support. But so men say that they support the addition of accessories, but
Mhm.
they don't wear condoms. I'm just curious about how you feel about that.
Hey, listen, my wife has made me wear a condom since I had my firstborn, and I resent it fully. So you know,
If we get a forward grip on it,
real,
then
real men wear condoms, okay? Or they have really strong,
Aesthetic reasons for aesthetic. For
yeah,
aesthetic.
or they have really strong pullout
Oh,
game.
tactical condoms.
Anyways,
Yeah.
To compensate for the lost masculinity, you just carry all the guns and the militarized shit while you're having sex. That's
exactly.
Oh, do
I
you
wear
know?
my gas mask. So anyway,
yeah.
so my point there is just the aesthetics can shift to a mindset change, and that mindset change can shift to tactics, and then that's where I hate to say it, but honestly, like veterans often get demonized for militarizing police departments, and oftentimes it's actually the opposite. The military veterans bring the tactics, but then the cops who were not veterans bring the chip on their shoulder because they're like, oh, I never served in the military, I never deployed overseas, I never did anything that intense. So this is my war. This is my, this is my thing. I'm gonna go fuck the bad guys up. Blah blah blah. All right, 2 more points, then I'll yield. Salaries plus overtime. You bringing up that like basically New York cops can make crazy good money if they do OT. Yeah, that's absolutely true because your base pay is dog shit. But if you work 60 hours a week every week, you can actually be half a lawyer, half a doctor, and all you have to do is sacrifice your health, your well-being, your lower back, your sanity, your patience for members of the public, your ability to interact with your friends, your family, and then that's where the persecution complex comes from. The persecution complex comes from I'm overworked, I'm tired, I'm paid almost a living wage, so I enjoy this job. I enjoy the purpose of my job, but then somebody tells me that I'm a fucking douche and my family deserves to get murdered. I call that person a motherfucker and I get written up. That's where the persecution complex comes from. And then Joe and other lefties, I want to give you a sneaky debate tactic for when you join the city councils.
Oh my God, please.
Basically, defunding doesn't have. So I think part of the pushback for defunding is people are imagining you taking away existing officers from the road. That's what they're imagining. Instead, what I think is smarter and more politically feasible is building it into the projected growth of the city because nobody is going to miss an officer that doesn't exist. So basically, if you say, instead of giving you 2 officers this year, which is like every 3 years, we're supposed to give you 2 new officers because of the projected growth. We're going to give you 1 officer, but we're going to give you a psych specialist who's going to run around with you guys, and he's going to take all your Baker Act calls. And you know what the patrol is going to say? Patrol is going to say, fuck yeah, are you telling me I don't have to do psych calls anymore? This is fucking awesome. I didn't even want another patrol guy. Give me a fucking psych guy. And then the following year, and when they're supposed to, or like 3 years later, when you get 2 fucking officers, take 1 away and give them the fucking EMT and be like, hey, we're trying out this new pilot program. We know that you guys have basic medical training, but we want to give you a guy who is on shift, can basically he can be primary on medical calls. So he's just flying to that fucking scene. That way he can do the hardcore medical shit that you guys are not competent to do. And by building it into growth, it becomes less politically controversial. And also it helps start chipping away at that systemic criminal bullshit where a patrol officer maybe isn't the solution that solves all problems.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, and that's literally within again, that's literally within my prescription about what like divestment and why I think that's incredible. Like that's why when I say divestment, I'm saying divestment and not defund. Because what's gonna happen is exactly what you described. Like you're validating other jobs because there needs to fill a role. Because again, if officers understand like it's ludicrous to be the be all end all on a call, then leaving up and distributing those tasks will really pinpoint, in my opinion, over time, what an officer ought to be. and then we can get a good idea of like, okay, this is what this is supposed to look like when we take all of these jobs that are part of the position because we might not have like the justification to fund them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but that prefix D is terrifying.
Yes.
And I know that like it's DI, not DE, but I think they're the same prefix if you look at the way that they operate as words.
Man, people just don't like D, huh?
No, they really don't. Because it means take away. That's what it means. So you're taking,
I think it means put in.
Yeah, well, your D means you're taking away something from me. Whereas what I would say is like enhance. Maybe like I don't want to defund the police department. I don't even want to divest them. I want to enhance law enforcement. I want to give them professionals that ride along with them, who make them better at their jobs, who help them de-escalate conflicted situations, who help them serve medical calls, who help them do their jobs better. So we stop this this aggressive binary where members of the public hate their law enforcement and law enforcement hates their community. We need to enhance law enforcement so they serve the purpose that they originally.
If you're looking for enhancements, I heard they got pills for that these days.
Yeah.
So
like as a,
I'll share my dick size once we we're no longer live.
Okay, so last point on this, Joe.
Yeah. Right. So and this is something that because I really want to get like
this close.
Adrian
I almost shared
involved.
it. I almost shared it.
Here's a comparison, right? Like one of the biggest frustrations that I had as a theater musician is when directors talk about things they know nothing about. And then the MD is just like, well, fuck me, right? And while the director has a particular purpose in a production, sometimes what happens is a director might just overstep their boundaries. And as an example that I can give, which is very, very, for those of you who don't know anything about theater, this is going to go over your head. There is a really just awful dance in Oklahoma. It's long, boring, and about drugs, basically.
Yes,
And basically the problem was, and then the production I was on is that there's like this scenic change that happens that's based on a audio cue. So, and basically from back of house and lighting, it's basically like everybody else understands like what to listen for, and they're able to like, and everybody's like sort of pseudo musicians. But then every time I was in this production, the director was like, "You guys aren't really like syncing up on this." And then the MD is like, "I'm on a headset with everyone, and we're all talking to each other. The reason why I'm not talking is because I'm doing the conducty thing." And then he was like, "Well, what if I conducted while you communicated with that?" And then I was just like, "Oh no, you don't take the ego from a conductor." And it basically turned into this back and forth of like, "You don't tell me how to do my job." And that's the understanding where like every position in any industry has a role, and then it's like just fulfill that role. And I think for officers, the idea of what that role is got kind of like miscombobulated into something that we ought to change.